Throughout history, the Vatican has confronted countless threats to faith and humanity, but few inspired as much fear and fascination as vampires. Unlike the devil, who represented a spiritual adversary, vampires were seen as a terrifying blend of the physical and supernatural, unholy creatures that corrupted both body and soul. Church records and medieval folklore describe them as blasphemous parodies of resurrection, mocking Christ's promise of eternal life. Their existence blurred the line between life and death, faith and heresy, making them a unique menace the Church sought to understand, contain, and ultimately destroy through ritual, exorcism, and doctrine. Cardinal Domenico Bellarmino had not slept in 6 days. His hands trembled as he held the quill, and not from age, though at 63, his joints complained with every movement. No, this tremor came from a deeper place, from the marrow of his bones where fear lived. The candle on his desk guttered, casting shadows that seemed to move with purpose across the stone walls of his private chamber. He dipped the quill and began to write. To His Holiness, Pope Urban VIII, a confession most grave and terrible. It had begun 3 weeks earlier, when Father Giuliano arrived from Venice with a wooden box he refused to let anyone else carry. The young priest's eyes had held the peculiar brightness of either madness or divine revelation. Bellarmino had seen enough of both to recognize the signs. "Your Eminence," Giuliano had said, placing the box on Bellarmino's desk with trembling hands. "I have brought you damnation itself." Inside the box, nestled in silk, lay a skull. But not just any skull. This one bore teeth that were far too long, far too sharp, and set in a jaw that seemed designed for violence. More disturbing was what had been inserted through the skull's empty eye sockets. 2 iron stakes, crossed like the bones on a pirate's flag, and sealed with lead. "The remains of Count Ludovico Veronesi," Giuliano explained. "6 months ago, the people of his village came to me. They said the Count had returned from death, that he walked at night, that children were disappearing, drained of blood, left like empty wineskins in the morning." Bellarmino had heard such stories before. Folklore, peasant superstition. He said as much. "That is what I believed, Your Eminence." Giuliano's voice dropped to a whisper. "Until I saw him with my own eyes. Until I watched him tear a man's throat open and drink. Until I witnessed him laugh as I pressed a crucifix to his flesh, and nothing happened. Nothing. The room seemed to grow colder. The crucifix did not burn him," Bellarmino asked. "No, Your Eminence, nor did holy water harm him. Nor did prayers cast him out. I stood in a church, in God's house, and spoke the most powerful exorcism rites we possess, and he simply smiled at me. He said," Giuliano's voice broke. "He said, 'Your God has no dominion over death, priest. Only we do.'" Bellarmino felt his mouth go dry. "How did you stop him?" "We didn't stop him. We destroyed him. Oak through the heart, then beheading, then fire, but not before." Giuliano pulled a journal from his robes, its pages covered in cramped handwriting. "Not before. I made him talk. I wanted to understand. I needed to know." Over the next 3 days, Bellarmino read Giuliano's journal. What he found there shook his faith to its foundations. The Count, in his final hours before destruction, had spoken freely. He claimed to be over 200 years old. He described a world beneath the world, a society of undead that stretched back to ancient Rome and beyond. He spoke of the profound pleasure of the hunt, the ecstasy of feeding, the intoxicating power of holding life and death in one's jaws. But worse, far worse, were his theological arguments. "You Christians speak of resurrection," the Count had said, "of eternal life, through Christ. But we are eternal life, achieved through our own power. We do not wait for God's grace. We do not beg for salvation. We take it. We transcend death, not through faith, but through will. Tell me, priest, which is the greater miracle, the promise of heaven after you die, or the certainty of never dying at all?" Giuliano had written. I had no answer for him. God forgive me. I had no answer. Bellarmino called for a secret conclave. He summoned 3 other cardinals he trusted, absolutely, men who understood that faith sometimes required confronting terrible truths. They met in a chamber that had once been a Roman emperor's torture room, now converted to the church's use. How fitting, Bellarmino thought bitterly. He presented the evidence, the skull, the journal, Father Giuliano's testimony. "If this is true," Cardinal Orsini said slowly, "if these creatures exist and our sacred rites have no power over them, then what does that say about the nature of God's authority?" "It says nothing," Cardinal Farnese snapped. "It is a deception, a test of faith." "Is it?" Cardinal Santori, the eldest among them, leaned forward. "Consider what we claim. We say that Christ conquered death, that resurrection is possible only through him, that the soul's journey after death is in God's hands alone. But if a creature can cheat death through purely physical means, through drinking blood like some sort of disease transmission, then resurrection is not a divine miracle. It is merely biology." "Heresy," Farnese breathed. "Yes," Santori agreed. "The greatest heresy imaginable, not because it denies God, but because it makes him irrelevant." The room fell silent. Somewhere in the Vatican above them, evening vespers were being sung. The faithful prayed, unaware that in this stone womb beneath their feet, their shepherds wrestled with the possibility that the entire Christian cosmology might be a lie. Bellarmino made his decision. "We destroy all evidence," he said. "The skull will be ground to dust and scattered. Father Giuliano will be sent to a monastery where he will take a vow of silence. His journal will be burned. We will send men to Venice to ensure no other records exist. And if more of these creatures appear," Orsini asked, "then we will destroy them quietly. In secret, we will create a special congregation, unknown to the wider church, tasked with hunting these abominations. But their existence must never be acknowledged, never be recorded in any official capacity, because to admit they exist is to admit that death can be cheated. And if death can be cheated, then Christ's resurrection was not unique, not divine, not proof of his nature as the Son of God." "You propose we lie," Farnese said. "I propose we protect the faith," Bellarmino corrected. "A demon, we can explain. Satan's power is vast, but ultimately temporary. A demon possesses a living soul, but a vampire is death itself, walking and talking and mocking everything we claim about the afterlife. They are not evil, Cardinal Farnese. Evil is understandable. Evil has a place in our theology. Vampires are something far worse. They are impossible. And we cannot allow the impossible to become known." The vote was unanimous. That night, as promised, Father Giuliano's journal burned. The skull was crushed in a mortar and pestle the powder mixed with holy water to create a gray sludge that Bellarmino personally poured into the Tiber River. Father Giuliano was dispatched to a silent order in the mountains, where he would spend the rest of his life in prayer, never speaking another word. And in the deepest vault of the Vatican, Bellarmino created the first entry in what would become the Codex Sanguinis, beginning a tradition of secret record-keeping that would span centuries. But as he wrote by candlelight, he could not shake the memory of the Count's words, as recorded by Giuliano: "You fear us not because we are evil, but because we are proof that your God is unnecessary. We are the resurrection and the life, priest, and we did it ourselves." Cardinal Bellarmino finished his report, sealed it, and locked it away. Then he knelt and prayed. But his prayers felt hollow, like words shouted into a vast emptiness. For the first time in his life, he wondered if anyone was listening. The candle went out, and Bellarmino sat in darkness, too afraid to relight it, too afraid of what he might see in the shadows. Brother Andreas felt the cold before he felt the fear. It came creeping through the monastery walls like water through cracked stone, a bone-deep chill that no fire could chase away. He pulled his woolen habit tighter and continued his nightly rounds, checking that all the doors were barred, all the windows shuttered. Outside, wind howled through the mountain passes, carrying snow that had been falling for 3 days straight. The monastery of San Cristoforo stood alone on its peak, isolated from the world below. 30 monks lived here, devoted to prayer and the copying of sacred texts. It was said that God's presence was stronger in high places, closer to heaven. But tonight, Brother Andreas felt no divine presence, only the cold. He had just finished checking the chapel when he heard the singing. It came from outside, a woman's voice, high and clear and beautiful, singing a melody he almost recognized, something from his childhood perhaps, before he'd taken his vows. The song pulled at him, made him want to open the heavy oak door and peer out into the storm. His hand was on the iron handle when Father Ignatius appeared beside him. "Step away from the door, brother." The old priest's voice was hard as flint. Andreas jerked his hand back, as if burned. "But, Father, there's someone out there. A woman. She'll freeze." "There is no woman," Ignatius said. "Or rather, there is no longer a woman. Only something wearing a woman's shape. Now come, we must wake the others." Within an hour, all 30 monks were gathered in the refectory, the only room with no windows and a door that could be barred from the inside. Father Ignatius stood before them, his weathered face grave. "My brothers," he began, "I had hoped never to speak of this, but the creature that hunts us tonight has left me no choice. 20 years ago, before I came to San Cristoforo, I served in Rome. I was a member of a special congregation, one that deals with threats to the church that cannot be spoken of openly." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The Vatican knows of certain creatures, undead things that were once human, but have become something else, something that feeds on blood. We call them strigo in the old texts, though you may know them by other names. Vampires." A ripple of unease passed through the assembled monks. Some crossed themselves. Brother Andreas felt his skin prickle. "I thought I had escaped this work when I came here," Ignatius continued. "I thought that if I climbed high enough, if I devoted myself purely enough to God, I might find peace. But tonight, one of them has found us. She has been circling the monastery for hours, testing our defenses. She cannot enter uninvited, That much of the old legends is true. But she will try to be invited. She will trick you. She will use your compassion against you. Can we not simply pray for protection? Asked Father Gregor, the youngest priest. Surely God will shield us. Ignatius's laugh was bitter. You would think so, wouldn't you? But these creatures exist outside God's law. They are dead things that walk. They have no souls to save, no spirits to exercise. They are meat and will and hunger, nothing more. Prayer does not touch them. Holy water does not burn them. The crucifix they will wear as jewelry, if it pleases them. Then how do we fight them? Andreas heard himself ask. We don't. We survive until dawn. We stay inside. We stay together. And we wait for the sun. Sunlight is the only truly reliable weapon against them. Even then, it only weakens them. To truly kill one, you must pierce the heart with wood, sever the head, and burn the remains. I have done this 3 times in my life, and each time I felt I was committing not an exorcism, but a murder. The singing started again, closer now. Definitely inside the monastery walls. She's in the courtyard, Brother Wilhelm whispered. Let her in, a voice called out. Everyone turned. Brother Martin, who worked in the kitchen, was standing near the door. His eyes had a glazed, distant look. She's cold. We should help her. It's our Christian duty. Ignatius moved with surprising speed for a man of 70, grabbing Martin's arm. She's in your head, boy. She's calling to you. Fight it. But Martin wasn't listening. With strength that should have been impossible for his thin frame, he shoved Ignatius aside and reached for the door. 3 monks tackled him before he could lift the bar. Martin screamed, fighting like a wild animal, frothing at the mouth. It took 5 men to hold him down. Bind him, Ignatius ordered. And gag him. The creature's influence is strong on him. As they tied Martin to a bench, the singing outside grew louder, more insistent. And then it changed, became deeper, multiplied. Now it was many voices, men and women both, singing in harmony. No, Ignatius breathed. Not one. She brought others. The monastery's heavy door shook as something struck it from outside. Twice, the thick oak groaned, but held. They cannot enter uninvited, Ignatius repeated, as if trying to convince himself. It is their one true limitation. A vampire cannot cross a threshold unless welcomed by someone who dwells within. As long as we all stay strong. Brother Thomas burst into the refectory, his face white with terror. Father, the western tower. Brother Carl was keeping watch and he opened the window. He called to them. There inside, panic erupted. Monks ran in all directions. Ignatius bellowed for order, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Andreas found himself running with a group toward the library, where the oldest and most valuable manuscripts were kept. If they were going to die tonight, they would die protecting holy knowledge. But halfway down the corridor, the group stumbled to a halt. She stood before them. The vampire was beautiful, in the way a sword is beautiful, cold, sharp, deadly. She wore a dress that might have been white once, but was now stained with old blood. Her eyes were entirely black, reflecting lamplight like an animal's. When she smiled, her teeth were needles. Good evening, brothers, she said, her voice musical and terrible. Thank you for inviting us in. We didn't. Andreas began, but she cut him off with a laugh. One of you did. That's all we needed. One weak moment, one act of mercy. She took a step forward, and the monks backed away. Do you know what we want? Can you guess? Father Ignatius pushed through the group, placing himself between the monks and the vampire. In his hand was a wooden stake, carved from what looked like an altarpiece. I know what you want, he said quietly. You want the texts, the books we copied last month, the ones describing vampire hunting techniques from the congregation's archives. She clapped her hands together. Oh, clever priest. Yes. Did you really think the Vatican could send its most secret knowledge to this lonely place without us noticing? We have eyes everywhere, even in Rome. Especially in Rome. Why do you care what's written about you? Ignatius demanded. You claim to be beyond God's reach. What does it matter what we know? Because knowledge is power, old man. And because every time one of you learns our weaknesses, learns how to truly kill us, it makes our existence harder. We cannot allow that knowledge to spread. We cannot allow the church to become efficient at hunting us. So we destroy the books. We kill the scholars. We erase ourselves from history, again and again, century after century. You fear us, Ignatius said, realization dawning on his face. You fear what would happen if humanity truly understood what you are. The vampire's smile vanished. We fear nothing, but we are practical. 100 humans with knowledge are more dangerous than 1,000 with superstition. She moved then, faster than thought. One moment, she was 10 feet away. The next she had Ignatius by the throat, lifting him off the ground. The stake clattered to the floor. Your God doesn't want you to know about us, she whispered in his ear, loud enough for all to hear. Haven't you wondered why? The Vatican hides us, destroys evidence of us, pretends we don't exist, and you think it's to protect the faith. But what if it's simpler than that? What if your church fathers simply cannot explain us, cannot fit us into their tidy little theology? We are the question they cannot answer, the proof that their system is incomplete. She dropped Ignatius, who crumpled to the floor, gasping. Burn the library, she ordered. And 2 more vampires appeared from the shadows. Take your time, make sure nothing survives. As for the monks, she looked at the terrified men before her. Leave enough alive to spread a different story. Tell them it was a fire, an accident. Make it mundane, forgettable. The night that followed would haunt Brother Andreas for the rest of his life. He hid in a cellar while above him the monastery burned. He heard screaming, heard laughter that was not human. When dawn finally came, he emerged to find 15 of his brothers dead, their throats torn open. The library was ashes. Father Ignatius had survived, but something had broken in him. He sat in the ruined chapel, staring at nothing, tears running down his soot-stained face. The official report to Rome said it was a tragic accident, a knocked-over candle. Many dead, most texts lost. The church sent condolences and money to rebuild, but in the secret chambers beneath the Vatican, where the Codex Sanguinis was kept, a new entry was made, and a note was added. They know we hunt them. They hunt us in return. This is not a war we can win, only one we can hide. Brother Andreas left the monastery 6 months later. He went to Rome and demanded to join the secret congregation that hunted vampires. They accepted him, as they accepted all survivors. Because survivors, they said, understood the truth that the Vatican feared vampires more than the devil, because the devil at least played by God's rules. Vampires didn't play at all. Monsignor Henry Beaumont considered himself a modern man. He believed in science, in reason, in the systematic cataloging of knowledge. His faith in God was unshakable, precisely because he approached it rationally, as an intellectual pursuit, rather than mere emotional conviction. Which is why, when he discovered the truth about vampires, his entire worldview shattered like dropped glass. It began innocuously enough. Beaumont had been assigned by the Vatican to investigate certain medieval texts that had been discovered in a Parisian library. The books had been part of a private collection, recently donated after the collector's death. Among them were several volumes that referenced the Congregatio Pro Doctrina Sanguis, a name Beaumont had never encountered in any of his theological studies. Curious, he began to research. What he found made no sense. The congregation appeared in fragmentary references across centuries of church documents, always in the margins, always in coded language. It seemed to be some sort of investigative body, but its purpose was never clearly stated. Beaumont requested access to the Vatican archives. His request was denied. He requested again, denied. A third time, invoking his authority as a Monsignor and his spotless record of service. This time, 3 men in plain clothes arrived at his Paris residence. Monsignor Beaumont, the eldest said, "We need to have a conversation." They took him to a private room in the Basilica of Sacré-Cœur. No windows. 1 door. 3 chairs and a table.
"You've been asking questions,"
the man said, "about the blood congregation."
"I have," Beaumont replied. "It's my job to research church history."
"Not this history." The man slid a document across the table. "This is a contract. You will sign it, agreeing never to speak of the congregation or its work. In exchange, we will not ruin your career and exile you to some frozen mission in Alaska." Beaumont read the contract. It was vague, threatening, and completely without legal weight. He looked up at the 3 men. "And if I refuse, then we tell you the truth," the youngest man said. "And trust me, Monsignor, you don't want that, because once you know, you can never unknow, and the burden of this knowledge has destroyed better men than you." Beaumont should have signed, should have walked away. But curiosity, that eternal human failing, was too strong. "Tell me," he said. So they did. They told him about vampires, about the undead that walked among humanity, about the Church's centuries-long effort to suppress all knowledge of them. They explained the theological implications, the danger to doctrine, the necessity of secrecy. Beaumont listened, and then he laughed. "You're insane," he said. "All of you, vampires. Undead monsters. This is folklore, not theology." The eldest man sighed. "We thought you'd say that." He stood. "Come with us. We'll show you." They took him to the catacombs beneath Paris, those endless tunnels lined with bones. Deep, deeper than tourists ever went, to places that hadn't seen light in centuries. Their lamps cast dancing shadows on walls made of skulls. Finally, they stopped before an iron door. The eldest man produced a key. His name was Philippe Moreau, he said. He was a priest, once, died in 1743. Except he didn't die. Not really. We've kept him here for 146 years. We feed him rats, sometimes criminals, that no one will miss. We study him, try to understand him, and every few years, when a scholar like you gets too curious, we bring them here. To see, to know. He opened the door. The cell beyond was small, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet. Chains hung from the walls. And in those chains, suspended like a puppet with cut strings, hung something that had once been a man. It raised its head as lamplight entered. Beaumont would never forget those eyes, black as pitch, bottomless. Ancient. Visitors. The thing croaked. Its voice was dry leaves, cracking leather. How wonderful. It's been. How long? 2 years, the eldest man said. This is Monsignor Beaumont. He doesn't believe you exist. The thing that had been Philippe Mauroy laughed. It was a terrible sound. Ah, a skeptic. How delightful. Come closer, Monsignor. Let me look at you. Beaumont found his feet, moving before his brain had given permission. He approached the cell. The creature leaned forward as far as its chains allowed. You have questions, it said. Ask them. I have nothing but time. Are you truly dead? Beaumont whispered. Dead? No, I am beyond death. I am the thing that comes after. Do you want to know what it's like, Monsignor? To have your heart stop beating and then keep walking? To need no breath yet speak, to feel your body decay slowly, so slowly while your mind remains sharp. The creature smiled, revealing those needle teeth. It's ecstasy. How is it possible? How can you exist? The same way anything exists. Physics, chemistry, biology. There is a pathogen, Monsignor, in the blood. It changes you at a fundamental level, rewrites what you are, makes you into something new. Something better. Your church calls it demonic, but it's not demonic. It's just different. An alternative path of evolution. Beaumont felt sick. You're saying vampirism is a disease. I'm saying it's a transformation, a glorious one. And it proves something your church has spent millennia trying to hide, that death is not a gateway to heaven or hell. Death is just a biological process, and like any process, it can be interrupted, subverted, conquered. But Christ's resurrection was what exactly? The creature's voice was soft, almost gentle. If I can rise from death through a blood pathogen, what does that say about the resurrection? Maybe Christ was the first vampire. Did you ever think of that? Maybe the wine that became blood was literal. Maybe the whole Christian mystery is just primitive people encountering the vampire transformation and interpreting it through a religious lens. Blasphemy. Beaumont breathed. Truth, the creature corrected. That's why they hide us. That's why they chain me down here in the dark, feeding me rats, keeping me secret, because I am the evidence that their entire faith is built on a misunderstanding. I am death, conquered, not by God, but by nature. The eldest man touched Beaumont's shoulder. Enough. We should go. As they led him away, Beaumont heard the creature's voice echoing through the catacombs. You can't unknow it now, Monsignor. You can't unsee. I am the truth your church fears. They took Beaumont back to the surface. He was shaking. The eldest man poured him brandy. Now you understand, he said, quietly. Now you see why we keep this secret. It's not just about protecting people from vampires. It's about protecting the entire foundation of Christian faith. If vampires are real, if they're just a biological phenomenon, then what is Christ? What is resurrection? What is salvation? I don't I can't. Beaumont couldn't finish the sentence. You have a choice, the man continued. Sign the contract. Never speak of this. Continue your work with this knowledge, locked away in your heart, or refuse, and we'll have to take more permanent measures. Beaumont signed. What else could he do? But that night, in his residence, he sat at his desk and began to write. Not for publication, not for sharing, just to process, to understand, to grapple with what he'd learned. He wrote, "If vampires exist as biological entities, then resurrection is not miraculous, but mechanical. If death can be transcended through natural means, then Christ's victory over death is not unique." The entire soteriology of Christianity rests on the premise that only through God can death be conquered. But if a pathogen can accomplish the same end, what does that make God unnecessary? A myth, a misinterpretation. He paused, quill trembling. The church is right to fear them, not because vampires are evil, though they surely are, but because they are impossible. They should not exist in a Christian universe. Their very existence is a refutation of our most basic theological claims. The devil we can explain. Demons we can contextualize. But vampires are proof that our entire understanding of life, death, and eternity is wrong. Beaumont never published his writings, never spoke of what he'd seen. He fulfilled his duties as a Monsignor for another 30 years, but something had broken in him. Those who knew him said he'd lost his passion, his fire. He went through the motions of faith without its substance. He died in 1919 in a small church in southern France. His last words, according to the priest who attended him, were, "I have believed a lie my entire life." His private writings were discovered after his death and promptly seized by agents of the Blood Congregation. They were burned, along with any other documents in his possession. The official Vatican biography of Monsignor Beaumont makes no mention of his crisis of faith, but in the catacombs beneath Paris, if you go deep enough past the tourist areas, past the bones into the places that aren't on any map, you might find an iron door. And behind that door, something that was once a priest still hangs in chains, waiting for the next skeptic to arrive, waiting to tell them the truth that destroys faith. The Second Vatican Council was in session, but tonight, a very different council was meeting in chambers that officially did not exist. Cardinal Giuseppe Benedetti stood before the assembled members of the Congregatio Pro Doctrina Sanguis. 20 men, all high-ranking church officials, all privy to the most dangerous secret in Catholic history. They had come from around the world for this emergency session. "Gentlemen," Benedetti began, "we have a crisis. For the first time in our history, vampires are organizing, not just in local covens or isolated groups, but globally. They're communicating, coordinating, and worst of all, they're planning to reveal themselves." A murmur ran through the assembly. "Impossible," Cardinal Romano said. "They've remained hidden for millennia. Why would they expose themselves now?" Benedetti gestured to a man standing in the shadows. "Perhaps our guest can explain. Cardinal Ortega, if you would introduce him." Ortega stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable. "Gentlemen, this is difficult to say, but we have been approached by a vampire who wishes to negotiate." The room erupted in shouts. Benedetti raised his hand for silence. "I know how this sounds, but hear us out. This vampire, he calls himself Marcus, came to us under a flag of truce. He wants to talk. And I believe we should listen, negotiate with these abominations. Romano sputtered. Never? Then we'll have war, Ortega said quietly. And we'll lose. Marcus has shown us proof. Photographs, documents, lists of names. He claims that there are over 10,000 vampires worldwide, 10,000 undead, organized, patient, and angry. He says they're tired of hiding, tired of being hunted, and they have a proposal. Benedetti nodded to the door. It opened, and a man walked in. He looked perfectly human, mid-30s, well-dressed in a modern suit, handsome in a way that made you want to trust him. Only his eyes gave him away. Too dark, too deep, too old. "Good evening, Your Eminences," Marcus said, his voice cultured and calm. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." "We agreed to nothing," Romano snapped. "You forced your way in here with threats." "Did I?" Marcus smiled. "I thought I presented you with facts and let you draw your own conclusions. But semantics aside, let me be direct. The world is changing. The modern age is here. Photography, film, mass media, these make it harder for us to remain hidden. And frankly, we're tired of it. Tired of your crusades against us. Tired of your secret murders and cover-ups. We want peace." "Peace," Benedetti said carefully. "What does that mean?" "Coexistence. We propose a treaty. We will maintain our secrecy, but you will stop hunting us. We'll regulate ourselves, keep the rogues in check, ensure that our feeding doesn't attract attention. In exchange, you acknowledge our right to exist." "You have no rights," Romano said. "You're dead." "You're abominations." Marcus's smile didn't waver. "Are we? By what theology? We're not demons. Your exorcisms don't work on us. We're not possessed. We have no foreign spirits controlling us. We're simply altered humans. Different, yes, but human in origin. Don't we deserve consideration?" "You kill people," Ortega said. "You feed on human blood." "Some of us do," Marcus admitted. "Just as some humans kill others for food, for pleasure, for ideology, we're no more uniformly evil than you are. There are vampires who've killed no one in centuries, who feed on animal blood, who've spent their immortality creating art, advancing science, preserving knowledge. But you don't see us. You only see monsters." Benedetti leaned forward. "Let's say we were to consider this. What exactly are you proposing?" "Simple. A non-aggression pact. We'll police our own. Any vampire who breaks our rules, kills carelessly, creates progeny without permission, draws attention, we'll handle them ourselves. You disband the blood congregation, destroy your vampire hunting manuals, stop teaching new generations of clergy how to kill us. And in return, we guarantee that the general human population never learns we exist." "Why would you want that?" Benedetti asked. "Why not simply reveal yourselves?" Marcus's expression turned grave. "Because we've run the numbers, Cardinal. We've studied history. If humans learned we existed, really believed it, there would be a crusade that would make the medieval ones look gentle. Modern weapons, modern surveillance, modern organization. Humanity would exterminate us within a generation. We don't want that. We just want to live, or exist, or whatever you'd call what we do. And what do we gain from this arrangement?" Romano demanded. "Continued secrecy. Marcus said. Think about it. Every time one of us is discovered, it threatens your theological framework. It raises questions you can't answer. Better for both of us if we remain a myth, a legend, something people don't quite believe in. The council talked long into the night. Arguments raged. Some wanted to reject the proposal outright. The year was 1746, and Father Pietro Salvatore had served the Holy See for 32 years without once questioning his faith. He had witnessed miracles that defied explanation, performed exorcisms that left him trembling for weeks, and counseled sinners whose confessions would have broken lesser men. But nothing in his long career had prepared him for the letter that arrived on a frost-laden December morning, sealed with black wax and bearing no mark of origin. The parchment trembled in his weathered hands as he read by candlelight in his modest quarters within the Vatican walls. The words were written in Latin so ancient that even he, a scholar of ecclesiastical texts, struggled with certain phrases. But the message was clear enough. Something unholy walked the villages north of Rome, and it was not the devil. Father Salvatore, a knock at his door, made him start. It was Cardinal Benedetto Romani, a man whose political acumen was matched only by his devotion to protecting the Church's secrets. His Holiness requires your presence immediately. Come alone and speak to no one of this summons. Pietro followed the cardinal through corridors he had never seen before, descending into depths of the Vatican he hadn't known existed. The air grew cold and damp, the walls shifting from ornate marble to rough-hewn stone that predated the Renaissance by centuries. Finally, they entered a circular chamber lit by oil lamps, where Pope Benedict XIV sat waiting, his face grave with concern. Father Salvatore, the Pope began without preamble, you have been chosen for a task that will test not only your faith, but your very understanding of creation itself. Tell me, what do you know of the Strigo? Pietro's mouth went dry. The Strigo, creatures of Romanian folklore that fed on the blood of the living, vampires. Your Holiness, they are merely superstition, peasant tales meant to explain natural phenomena. That is what we have allowed the world to believe, interrupted Cardinal Romani. The truth is far more troubling. For centuries, the Church has maintained a secret archive documenting encounters with these creatures. They are real, Father, and they are an abomination that threatens the very foundations of our theology. The Pope rose from his seat, moving to a locked cabinet built into the wall. From it, he withdrew a manuscript bound in leather, so old it was nearly black. This is the Codex Sanguinis, the Blood Codex. It has been kept by every pope since Innocent VIII, passed down in secrecy, added to by those unfortunate enough to encounter these creatures. What it reveals is heresy of the highest order, or it would be if anyone outside this room knew of its contents. Pietro accepted the tome with reverent horror. The pages within were filled with accounts dating back to the early days of Christianity, villages drained of life, corpses that walked, the dead who refused to stay buried. But it was the theological annotations that truly chilled him. Your Holiness, this suggests that vampires possess something that should be impossible. They retain their souls even after death. Precisely, said the Pope, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries of concealed truth. The devil we understand. He is a fallen angel, working within the framework of God's creation to tempt and corrupt souls. But vampires, they are an anomaly that our doctrine cannot explain. They are dead, yet they think. They have no heartbeat, yet they scheme and desire. They should be in purgatory, or hell, Yet they walk the earth, existing in a state that makes a mockery of everything we teach about death and salvation. Cardinal Romani stepped forward, his expression grim. 3 weeks ago, a village near Assisi was found empty. Every man, woman, and child gone. No bodies, no blood, just empty homes and livestock left to starve in their pens. This was the 5th village in 6 months. The local bishops have been covering up the incidents, attributing them to plague or bandits, but we have reports from witnesses, survivors who escaped. They speak of a woman in black, who moves faster than the eye can follow, who commands a small army of the undead. She calls herself the Contessa Margherita, and she is making no effort to hide what she is. Why now? Pietro asked. If these creatures have existed for centuries, why reveal themselves so boldly? The Pope and Cardinal exchanged a glance that spoke of knowledge even more disturbing than what they had already shared. Because, Benedict XIV said slowly, she seeks an audience with us. The Contessa has sent word that she will come to Rome, to the Vatican itself, at the new moon, 3 weeks hence. She wishes to negotiate. Pietro felt his legs weaken. Negotiate. What could such a creature possibly want from the Holy See? Recognition. Cardinal Romani spat the word like poison. She wants the Church to acknowledge vampires as a separate creation, as beings with souls that fall outside the covenant between God and humanity. She wants us to declare that they are not damned, merely different. Can you imagine the chaos we would have to rewrite? 2 millennia of doctrine. Every funeral, every last rites, every promise of salvation we have made would be called into question. The very nature of the soul, of free will, of redemption, all of it would crumble. And if we refuse, Pietro whispered. The Pope's aged eyes met his. Then she has promised to turn a cardinal before the eyes of Rome itself, to demonstrate that the Church cannot even protect its own princes. The scandal would destroy us, Father. Not because people would fear vampires, but because they would no longer trust our understanding of the divine. How can we claim to know God's will when we cannot even explain these creatures' existence? Pietro understood now why he had been summoned. You need me to find a way to destroy her, not just kill her, but erase any evidence that she existed. More than that, the Pope said, you must determine the truth. The Codex contains accounts. Yes, but they are contradictory. Some vampires seem to be mindless beasts. Others, like this Contessa, possess intelligence and purpose. Some were evil in life and remain so in death, but others. He paused, clearly troubled. Others were good Christians who died violently and rose again, confused and horrified by what they had become. They begged priests for help, for salvation. And we destroyed them because we had no other answer to give. The weight of centuries of secret murder settled on Pietro's shoulders. You want to know if they have souls? I want to know, said Benedict XIV, his voice breaking slightly. If we have been committing an unforgivable sin for 2,000 years, if these creatures can be saved, if they fall within God's grace despite their cursed state, then we have been destroying thinking, feeling beings without trial or mercy. We have been playing God, deciding who deserves salvation and who deserves obliteration. Cardinal Romani placed a hand on Pietro's shoulder. You have 3 weeks to research the Codex, to interview the few experts we trust, to prepare yourself. Then you will meet the Contessa Margherita. You will speak with her, assess her nature, and determine the truth. and if necessary, he pressed a wooden stake into Pietro's hand, the point sharpened to deadly perfection. You will do what must be done. As Pietro left the chamber, the codex tucked under his arm and the stake hidden in his robes, he found himself praying, not for courage, but for wisdom, for he understood now the terrible burden the church had carried in secret. The devil was simple, evil was simple, but a thinking, feeling creature that existed outside the natural order, that challenged every assumption about life and death and the soul. That was terrifying in a way that all of hell's torments could never match. Because if vampires had souls, if they could reason and suffer and perhaps even love, then they deserved compassion. And compassion for the undead meant questioning everything the church had built its authority upon. Father Pietro Salvatore had 3 weeks to find answers that centuries of popes had failed to uncover. 3 weeks before the Contessa came to Rome, and the carefully maintained lie that protected the church's authority would finally shatter. The night outside his window seemed darker than usual as he opened the codex and began to read. Somewhere in those ancient pages lay the truth about vampires. And Pietro suspected that truth would be far more damaging to the church than any creature of the night could ever be. For 17 days and 17 nights, Father Pietro Salvatore barely slept. His modest quarters transformed into a scholar's fortress, the walls lined with texts pulled from the Vatican's most restricted archives. The Codex Sanguinis lay open on his desk, its pages marked with strips of cloth, as he cross-referenced accounts spanning 2 millennia. What he discovered was a history of fear masquerading as righteousness. The earliest entries were the most troubling. In the year 156 AD, a Christian community in Thrace reported that their beloved bishop, martyred by Roman soldiers, had risen from his grave. But he had not returned as a mindless corpse. Instead, he wept at what he had become, refusing to enter churches, though he desperately wished to pray. The account described how he had retained all his memories, his faith, his love for his flock. Yet he needed blood to survive. The brothers debated for 3 days. Pietro read aloud to the empty room, translating the ancient Greek. Some said he was possessed by demons. Others argued that no demon could weep at the sight of the cross or recite scripture with such devotion. Finally, it was decided that this state was a test from God, that the bishop must resist the hunger until he faded to dust, proving the supremacy of will over flesh. But he could not resist. After 40 days, he fed upon a Roman soldier who had tortured him in life. The brothers then destroyed him with fire and holy water, though many questioned whether they had committed murder rather than performed a mercy. Pietro found himself haunted by that phrase, whether they had committed murder. The uncertainty had been there from the beginning, buried in the church's foundational years. As Christianity spread, so did the accounts. Some vampires were indeed monsters, former criminals and pagans who embraced their curse and reveled in slaughter. But others were tragic. A noble woman in Gaul who turned away her own children to protect them. A monk in Egypt who starved himself into dormancy rather than harm the innocent. A physician in Constantinople who only fed on the already dying, easing their pain as he took what he needed to survive. The church's response was always the same. Destroy them. Better to err on the side of caution than to risk theological catastrophe. Pietro found a letter tucked into the Codex, dated 1312, written by a pope whose name had been deliberately effaced from the record. The handwriting was shaky, the Latin emotional. I cannot sleep for the dreams. We burned her yesterday, the French girl who claimed to hear the voice of God even after death. She was staked and blessed and reduced to ash, but her final words haunt me. I forgive you, Holy Father, for you know not what you do. Christ's own words, spoken by a creature we claim is damned. What if we are wrong? What if God, in his infinite mystery, has purposes for these beings that we, in our limited wisdom, cannot comprehend? But I dare not speak these doubts aloud. The Church's authority rests on our certainty. If we admit we do not know, that we cannot explain, then what good are we to the faithful? Pietro set down the letter with trembling hands. Here was the truth, written by a pope 6 centuries ago. The Church feared vampires not because they were evil, but because they were inexplicable. On the 18th day, Cardinal Romani visited, bringing with him an unexpected guest, a nun named Sister Caterina, whose face bore the hardened look of someone who had witnessed horrors. Sister Caterina runs a hospice for the dying in the countryside, the cardinal explained. For the past decade, she has been keeping records of her own. Records we deemed too dangerous to include in the official codex. The nun's voice was steady as she spoke. I have met 4 vampires in my time, Father Salvatore. One I helped to destroy. It was a murderer in life, and remained so in death, slaughtering travelers without remorse. But the other 3. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The other 3 came to me seeking help. They were horrified by what they had become. They wanted to know if they could still receive communion, if their prayers still reached heaven, if there was any path to redemption for them. What did you tell them? Pietro asked. I told them the truth, that I did not know, but I offered them what comfort I could. One chose to walk into the sunrise after a night of prayer. Another I have been sheltering in my cellar for 7 years. He feeds only on animals and spends his nights transcribing scripture. The third, her voice broke. The third was discovered by vampire hunters. They destroyed him while he was teaching orphans to read. Pietro felt anger rising in his chest. Why was I not told of this before? Cardinal Romani's expression was pained. Because Sister Caterina's actions constitute heresy, Father. She has been harboring a vampire, providing its sanctuary. By church law, she should be excommunicated, and the creature destroyed. But His Holiness has stayed his hand, because we need answers more than we need doctrinal purity. The vampire she shelters, his name was Francesco in life. He is the only one we know of who has maintained his humanity for years. We need you to meet him. That night, under the cover of darkness, Pietro was taken to Sister Caterina's hospice. They descended into a cellar that had been reinforced with bars and crosses, not to trap Francesco, as Pietro initially assumed, but to protect him from those who might wish him harm. The vampire, who emerged from the shadows, was not the monster Pietro had imagined. He was slight, perhaps 30 in appearance, with the bearing of a scholar. His clothes were simple, his manner gentle. Father, Francesco greeted him with a small bow. I know why you have come. The Contessa Margherita. I knew her in life, before we were changed. Tell me about her, Pietro said, settling onto a stool. Sister Caterina provided. Francesco's eyes, still human in their expressiveness, despite their unnatural color, grew distant with memory. Margherita was a countess of great learning and greater faith. When plague came to her lands, she sold her jewels to buy medicine. She tended the sick with her own hands. I was her secretary. And I loved her. Though I never spoke of it, we both fell ill. We both died, and we both rose again. 3 days later. What happened then? At first, we were lost in confusion and hunger. We did terrible things, Father. We killed, we fed. But as the madness of new awakening faded, we remembered who we were. Margarita wept for days when she understood what we had become. She tried everything. Prayer, fasting, pilgrimage. She sought out priests and begged them for absolution. They called her a demon and tried to destroy her. That was when she changed. Francesco moved to a small desk, pulling out a sheaf of papers covered in neat handwriting. She began to study what we are. She sought out other vampires, interviewed them, documented their experiences. She developed a theory, Father, and it is one that the Church will find unforgivable. Tell me, Margarita believes that we are not cursed by God, but that we are a natural, albeit rare variation in the order of creation. Like wolves or eagles, we are predators who need blood to survive. Our consciousness, our souls, persist because they are not tied to our heartbeat, but to something more fundamental. We are not dead in the way the Church defines death. We are transformed, and if we are simply another form of life, then we fall under God's covenant with all living things. We are capable of sin, yes, but also of virtue, of salvation. Pietro felt his theological foundations crumbling. That would mean the Church has been wrong, Francesco finished quietly, and that is why she seeks an audience, not to threaten. Though I know she has taken villages to force the Holy See's hand, she wants recognition. She wants the Church to admit that we exist outside your doctrines, and that you have been destroying thinking beings without justification. And if the Church refuses, then she will reveal herself to the world and let humanity decide. She has been gathering vampires to her cause for years. Hundreds of us. We have infiltrated noble houses, merchant guilds, even monasteries. We have documented our histories, our thoughts, our struggles with faith and morality. She will publish it all, Father, and the Church's authority will crumble when people realize you have been lying about the nature of death and the soul for 2,000 years. Pietro stood, his mind reeling. She would destroy the faith of millions to save herself. No, Francesco said firmly. She would destroy a comfortable lie to reveal an uncomfortable truth. Is that not what Christ himself did? The Pharisees had their doctrines, their certainties. He challenged them. He revealed that God's mercy was broader than they imagined. Margarita is not the devil, Father Salvatore. She is a reformer, and like all reformers, she is dangerous to those in power. As Pietro left the hospice, the stake still hidden in his robes felt heavier than before. In 3 days, the Contessa Margarita would arrive, and he still had no answer to the question that tormented him. Did vampires have souls? And if they did, what terrible sin had the Church been committing in the name of righteousness? The new moon rose over Rome, bringing with it a darkness that felt laden with prophecy. Father Pietro Salvatore stood in the Sistine Chapel, the greatest achievement of Christian art surrounding him, and wondered if he was about to witness the end of everything his Church represented. Pope Benedict XIV sat on a simple throne that had been brought in for the occasion. Beside him stood Cardinal Romani, and flanking them were a dozen priests, Pietro recognized as the Church's most accomplished exorcists. Each carried blessed silver, holy water, and stakes of ash wood. They were Pietro realized with grim irony, a firing squad dressed in vestments. She comes, whispered Cardinal Romani, and Pietro felt it too, a change in the air, a presence that made the candles flicker, despite the chapel's stillness. The great doors swung open without anyone touching them. The woman who entered was magnificent and terrible in equal measure. Contessa Margherita wore black silk that seemed to absorb light, and her beauty was of the kind that made men forget to breathe. But it was her eyes that held Pietro's attention. Ancient eyes that had seen empires rise and fall, yet still held a spark of the mortal woman she had once been. She walked alone, her footsteps echoing on marble, showing no fear despite being surrounded by the church's champions. When she reached the appropriate distance from the Pope, she did not kneel. She simply inclined her head with the respect one sovereign might show another. "Your Holiness," she said, her voice carrying the accent of a Rome long vanished. "Thank you for granting me this audience." "We did not grant it," Pope Benedict XIV replied, his voice steady, though Pietro could see the tremor in his hands. "You forced it through threats and violence. 5 villages, Contessa, 5 villages emptied of life." "Not emptied," she corrected gently. "Transformed. Every soul from those villages still exists. Holy Father, they walk and think and feel. I turned them to prove a point, that you can no longer pretend we do not exist, that your comfortable lies about death and salvation can no longer be maintained." Cardinal Romani's voice shook with rage. "We offer truth and salvation through Christ. You offer certainty where none exists." Margherita interrupted. "You tell the faithful that they know what happens after death, that the righteous go to heaven and the sinful to hell, that the soul departs the flesh at the moment of ending. But here I stand, Cardinal, dead by every measure your doctrine provides, yet thinking, feeling, speaking. My soul, for I do possess one, remains bound to this flesh. How does your theology explain me?" Pietro found himself stepping forward, unable to remain silent. "You speak of your soul with such certainty. How do you know you still possess one? Could you not simply be an echo, a memory trapped in corrupted flesh?" Margherita's gaze shifted to him, and Pietro felt the weight of her attention like a physical force. "Father Salvatore, I have read your thoughts in the Codex Sanguinis. Yes, I know of its existence. You are the one they sent to determine the truth. Let me ask you this. What is a soul? The immortal essence, granted by God the seat of consciousness and free will? Then I have one," she said simply. "I am conscious. I exercise free will. I chose not to kill for decades after my transformation, sustaining myself on animal blood and the willing donations of those I had helped in life. I experience love, sorrow, anger, joy. I pray, Father. Though I do not know if God still hears me, I fear damnation. I hope for salvation. What is that, if not a soul?" Pope Benedict XIV leaned forward. "Yet you feed on human blood. You are a predator that requires the death of innocents to survive. As do you," Margherita countered. "Your church has killed more innocents in the name of righteousness than I could drain in 10 lifetimes. You have burned heretics, drowned witches, sanctioned wars and pogroms. When a wolf kills a lamb, do you damn the wolf, or do you recognize that it is simply following its nature, the nature God gave it? We are not animals," Cardinal Romani shouted. "We are made in God's image." "And what if I am too?" Margherita's voice rose for the first time, passionate and pain-filled. What if this transformation is not a curse, but simply a rare variation in God's creation? You catalog angels and demons, saints and sinners. Why can you not accept that there might be beings who exist between life and death, neither wholly one nor the other? Why must your theology be so rigid that it cannot encompass the full mystery of God's plan? Pietro felt his carefully constructed arguments crumbling. Everything she said resonated with the doubts he had discovered in the Codex, the questions that popes had been asking themselves in secret for centuries. Because Pope Benedict XIV said quietly, "If we admit we were wrong about vampires, then what else are we wrong about? If the soul can persist in dead flesh, then what of resurrection? What of Christ's promise? If you can exist in this state, neither alive nor truly dead, then our entire understanding of salvation becomes questionable. Do you not see, Contessa? You are not a threat because you are evil. You are a threat because you are possible." The silence that followed was profound. Margherita's expression softened, and for the first time, Pietro saw sadness in those ancient eyes. "I do see," she said, "and that is the true tragedy. You would rather maintain a comfortable lie than face an uncomfortable truth. You would rather kill beings who think and feel than admit that your understanding of God's creation is incomplete." She reached into her gown and withdrew a leather journal, placing it on the floor between herself and the Pope. "This contains testimonies from 300 vampires. Some are monsters. I will not deny it. They were evil in life and remain so in death. But others are saints who struggle daily against their nature. Former priests who still serve God in whatever way they can. Mothers who refuse to harm children, though they hunger terribly. Scholars who have spent centuries studying creation in an attempt to understand why we exist." Margherita stepped back from the journal, her movements deliberate. "I am offering the Church a choice, Holy Father. You can read these testimonies. You can acknowledge that we are complex beings capable of both good and evil, deserving of judgment as individuals rather than being destroyed on sight. Or you can continue as you have, and I will take this journal to the printers of Amsterdam, and the world will learn the truth, that the Church has been systematically destroying thinking beings out of fear and ignorance. That is blackmail," Cardinal Romani hissed. "That is the only option left to me," Margherita replied. "I have tried prayer. I have tried pleading. I have tried living in hiding, pretending we do not exist. Nothing has worked. So now I offer you the truth and the choice of what to do with it." Pope Benedict XIV stood slowly, his aged frame carrying the weight of his office. "And if we choose to maintain our doctrine, if we decide that the preservation of faith is more important than acknowledging your existence," Margherita's smile was sad, "then you will have chosen comfort over truth. And that, Holy Father, is the one sin I believe God will not forgive." Pietro found himself speaking, his voice carrying across the chapel. "There is a third option." All eyes turned to him. Cardinal Romani looked furious at the interruption, but the Pope raised a hand, granting Pietro permission to continue. "What if," Pietro said carefully, "the Church does not have to choose between acknowledging vampires or maintaining doctrine? What if instead we do what we have always done when faced with mystery? Admit that we do not fully understand, but trust in God's wisdom. Explain," the Pope commanded. Pietro moved to the center of the chapel, positioning himself between the Church's authorities and the vampire countess. The early Church Fathers spent centuries debating the nature of Christ, fully God, fully man, or something else. They eventually settled on mystery, that both were simultaneously true, even though human logic said this was impossible. Could we not do the same with vampires? Acknowledge that they exist in a state that our theology cannot fully explain, but that this does not invalidate our faith, merely reveals its limitations. Margarita's eyes widened slightly, a spark of hope appearing. Pietro continued, his thoughts racing. We could establish a framework. Vampires who maintain their humanity and struggle against their predatory nature could be offered guidance and support. Those who embrace evil and slaughter innocents would be destroyed, just as we would execute any human murderer. We would not be changing our doctrine about salvation, merely acknowledging that the nature of death and consciousness is more complex than we previously understood. That would require, Cardinal Romani began. It would require humility. Pietro interrupted, shocking himself with his boldness. It would require the Church to admit that we do not have all the answers, that God's creation contains mysteries we may never fully comprehend. Is that not closer to the truth? Anyway, do we truly understand the Trinity, the nature of grace, the mechanics of transubstantiation? We accept these as mysteries of faith. Why can we not accept vampires the same way? Pope Benedict XIV sank back onto his throne, his expression troubled. Because mysteries of faith strengthen belief, this could destroy it, or strengthen it in a new way. Pietro argued, by showing that the Church is capable of growth, of adapting to new knowledge while maintaining core truths. We would be following Christ's example. He broke bread with sinners and tax collectors, those the religious authorities deemed irredeemable. Are vampires not also outcasts, deserving of compassion if they truly struggle against their nature? Margarita moved forward, and the exorcists tensed, but she simply knelt, the first sign of submission she had shown. I would accept such terms, she said quietly. I would swear an oath before God that I would police my own kind, destroying those who become monsters while protecting those who retain their humanity. I would work with the Church rather than against it. All I ask is acknowledgement that we are not simply demons to be destroyed on sight, but complex beings worthy of individual judgment. The Pope closed his eyes, and Pietro knew he was praying. The silence stretched for an eternity, broken only by the guttering of candles. Finally, Benedict XIV opened his eyes. I cannot make this decision alone. It would require a council, debates that could last years. But he paused, reaching for the journal Margarita had placed on the floor. I will read this. I will convene a secret council of our most trusted theologians, and I will pray for guidance. He fixed Margarita with a stern gaze. But know this, Contessa. If even one more innocent dies at the hands of you or your kind while we deliberate, I will unleash every vampire hunter the Church can muster. There will be no negotiation, no mercy, no acknowledgement. Do you understand? I understand, Holy Father. Margarita rose gracefully. And I accept those terms. No innocent will die by our hands. You have my word, sworn before God in his house. As she turned to leave, Pietro found himself calling out, Contessa, wait. She paused, looking back at him with ancient, weary eyes. The 5 villages you transformed, were they truly willing? For the first time, Margarita's composure cracked, and Pietro saw genuine anguish. No, Father, they were not. That is my sin, and I will answer for it when I face God's judgment. But I saw no other way to force this conversation. I am 500 years old, Father Salvatore. I have watched the church burn, stake, and destroy my kind for centuries, often with no more justification than superstition and fear. I am tired of hiding. I am tired of watching those I love destroyed. So yes, I committed an evil to force a greater good. Judge me for it, if you must, but do not pretend the church has not done the same throughout its history. She left then, melting into shadows that seemed to welcome her. The doors closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the chapel. Cardinal Romani was the first to speak. "This is madness, Your Holiness. We cannot negotiate with demons." But Pope Benedict XIV was staring at the journal in his hands, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps they are not demons, Cardinal. Perhaps they are something we have no name for. And if that is the case, then we have committed a grave sin indeed." He looked at Pietro, and in the Pope's eyes, the young priest saw fear, not of vampires, but of truth. "Father Salvatore, you will lead the secret council. You will read this journal, interview Francesco, and any other vampire Sister Caterina can help us locate safely. You will determine once and for all whether these beings possess souls worthy of salvation. The future of the church may rest on your answer." Pietro accepted the burden, though it felt heavier than any penance he had ever been given. As the assembled priests filed out of the Sistine Chapel, he remained, looking up at Michelangelo's magnificent ceiling. God reaching out to Adam, fingers nearly touching, bringing the divine spark of life and consciousness. What if that spark could persist even in death? What if God's creation was so grand, so incomprehensibly vast, that it included beings who existed between life and death, neither wholly one nor the other? The church had feared vampires more than the devil, because the devil was simple. Evil was simple, but compassion for the damned, mercy for those who existed outside doctrine, humility in the face of mystery, those were hard. Those required the church to admit it did not have all the answers. Pietro looked down at the stake, still hidden in his robes. He drew it out, and after a moment's hesitation, broke it across his knee. The sound echoed through the empty chapel like a gunshot. Whatever the council decided, whatever theological framework they eventually constructed, Pietro knew one thing with certainty. He would not be party to thoughtless destruction anymore. If vampires were to be destroyed, it would be after trial and judgment, not assumption and fear. The night outside the Vatican walls was still dark, but to Pietro it seemed a bit less frightening. In the darkness, there were monsters. But there were also complex beings, struggling with an existence they never asked for, capable of both good and evil, just like any human. And if the church could not find room in its theology for that truth, then perhaps it was the church that needed to change. 3 weeks later, the secret council convened. Their deliberations would last 18 months and would never be recorded in official church history, but in a hidden archive in the Vatican, accessible only to each new pope upon their election. A document was added to the Codex Sanguinis. It was titled, "On the Nature of Vampires and Other Beings Who Exist Between Life and Death." It did not offer definitive answers. Instead, it acknowledged mystery, urged compassion, and called for individual judgment rather than blanket condemnation. The document was signed by Pope Benedict XIV and countersigned by Father Pietro Salvatore, who would himself become a cardinal within 10 years. And in a small hospice outside Rome, Sister Caterina read the news to Francesco, who wept tears of blood at the knowledge that perhaps there might be salvation for him after all. The church had not stopped fearing vampires, but it had learned to fear its own ignorance more. And in that shift, in that small gesture toward humility and truth, something new was born, a theology that could encompass mystery, a faith that could grow and adapt, a church that could admit it did not have all the answers while still maintaining hope for grace. It was not a perfect solution, but then, in a world that contained vampires, perhaps perfection was never the point. Perhaps the point was simply to seek truth, show compassion, and trust that God's creation was large enough to hold them all, the living, the dead, and those who somehow managed to be both. They gave me 3 days in that chamber, though I didn't know it would be exactly 3 when I started. My name is Elena Corvino. For 14 years, I've restored sacred art throughout Italy, mostly Renaissance work, occasionally Byzantine pieces that require the delicate touch of someone who understands how pigment behaves after centuries of candle smoke and incense. I've worked in cathedrals from Milan to Palermo. I've cleaned altarpieces that hadn't been touched since Napoleonic soldiers used them for target practice, but I'd never worked directly for the Vatican until February of 2024, when the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology contacted me about San Clemente, not the basilica itself, a chamber beneath it that most restorationists don't know exists. Father Giuliano met me at dawn on a Monday. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the sort of measured speech that comes from years of choosing words carefully. We entered through a service door behind the apse, then descended stairs. I would later realize don't appear on any architectural survey of the church. The stone was older than the 12th century structure above, possibly 4th century, from the original basilica, though Father Giuliano offered no history, and I knew better than to ask. The chamber itself was small, maybe 4 meters square, with a barrel-vaulted ceiling entirely covered by a fresco of 6 seraphim. Each angel had 6 wings, as described in the book of Isaiah, 2 covering their faces, 2 covering their feet, 2 for flight. The style was Byzantine, formal and hieratic, rendered in the deep blues and gold leaf characteristic of that period. What made it unusual was the arrangement. The 6 seraphim formed a perfect circle, their wingtips almost touching, surrounding a central space that had been damaged at some point. The plaster there was missing, exposing bare stone. The commission requires complete documentation before any structural work begins, Father Giuliano explained. Photographs, condition reports, pigment analysis. Clean what you can, but documentation is the priority. He handed me 2 copper keys on a red cord. The outer door locks from the corridor. The inner door, he gestured to a second door, I hadn't noticed, set into the eastern wall, remains locked at all times. Under no circumstances are you to open it. What's beyond it? A space we don't use anymore. His tone suggested the conversation was finished. I'll return each evening at 6 o'clock. You'll have complete privacy for your work. The chamber had no windows, no ventilation beyond a small grate near the floor. I set up my equipment by the light of LED panels, scaffolding, cameras, my cleaning solutions, and soft brushes. The air smelled of stone and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. Not decay, more like the scent of a room where something important once happened, where the walls themselves remember. I began with photographs, documenting every centimeter of the fresco from multiple angles. The seraphim were extraordinary, each face serene, but somehow alert, their dark eyes rendered with such precision that they appeared to have depth, real depth, as if the artist had somehow painted not just the surface of an eye, but the consciousness behind it. By mid-afternoon, I'd completed my initial assessment and begun testing cleaning methods on a small section of the uppermost angel's wing. The centuries of grime came away easily, revealing colors that seemed to glow even in artificial light. Lapis lazuli blue, gold leaf that caught every photon, and beneath it all, such meticulous detail in each feather that I had to use magnification to appreciate the full craftsmanship. I worked until Father Giuliano returned at 6. He examined my progress with approval, then escorted me out through those unmapped corridors. I didn't ask why the chamber required such secrecy. In my profession, you learn that the church has reasons for everything, and most of those reasons are older than you can imagine. That night, reviewing my photographs at home, I noticed something odd. The uppermost seraph, the one I'd been cleaning, appeared to be looking downward in my morning shots. In the evening photographs, its gaze seemed angled slightly to the right, toward the damaged center of the fresco. I told myself it was a trick of the lighting. Fresco is painted on plaster. It doesn't move. On the second day, I arrived to find the chamber exactly as I'd left it. Or so I thought at first. I took fresh photographs before beginning work, standard procedure for restoration projects. Then I climbed the scaffolding to continue cleaning the first angel's wings. That's when I realized its head position had changed. Not dramatically, perhaps 10 or 15 degrees, but enough that there was no mistaking it. The seraph was now looking directly at the center of the fresco, at that damaged space. I checked my morning photographs against yesterday's evening shots. The position was different, measurably, undeniably different. I spent an hour examining the plaster for any signs of structural movement, settling, moisture damage, anything that might cause the paint to shift. The substrate was solid, centuries stable. There was no logical explanation, but I was a professional, and the commission had hired me to document, so I documented. I took measurements of every angel's position, head angle, wing placement, the distance between their wingtips. I used a laser level to establish reference points and recorded everything in my notebook with precise timestamps. Then I continued cleaning. By noon, I'd moved to the second seraph, the one to the left of the first. As I worked, I became increasingly aware of those dark eyes. All 6 angels, even the ones I hadn't yet cleaned, seemed to be watching me, not with hostility, with expectation, as if they were waiting for me to notice something. I looked up often, studying the overall composition. The circle of seraphim, the damaged center, the negative space between their wings. Father Giuliano arrived at 6. I showed him my measurements, explained what I'd observed. He studied my documentation for a long time, his expression unreadable. "Continue your work tomorrow," he said finally, "but do not attempt to open the eastern door." I wasn't. I know. I'm simply reminding you. He paused at the threshold. Some things require containment, Elena, not because they're evil, but because they're true in ways we're not prepared to understand. I barely slept that night. At 3:17 in the morning, I woke with absolute clarity, thinking about those measurements, about the geometry of the angels' positions. I got up and plotted everything on graph paper. The 6 seraphim formed a circle, their wingtips nearly touching. But when I calculated the angles between their current positions, they didn't sum to 360 degrees. They summed to 373.5. That's impossible in Euclidean geometry, in flat space. But what if the fresco wasn't depicting flat space? I measured the wingspans next, using the scale references from my photographs. Each angel's wings, when fully extended, should have been roughly equal in length. They weren't. The measurements described a curve, not around the circle, but inward, spiraling toward that damaged center. On the third day, I entered the chamber and knew immediately that something had changed. All 6 seraphim had shifted. Their heads were now angled inward, focused completely on the center. And their wings. The geometry of their wings made my eyes hurt. The angles were wrong, not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. They bent in ways that shouldn't be possible in 3-dimensional space, creating shapes that my brain couldn't quite process. When I photographed them and tried to measure the distances, my instruments gave readings that contradicted each other. A wingspan that measured 120 centimeters from one angle measured 98 from another, without any change in position. I climbed to the top of the scaffolding, my hands shaking. I needed to examine that damaged center more closely. From up close, I could see that the plaster hadn't eroded naturally. It had been chiseled away, deliberately removed, but the destruction was recent, perhaps only a few decades old, based on the tool marks, and beneath the damage, I could see what they'd been trying to hide. Text, not painted on the plaster, but written in the negative space between the converging wings. The precise geometry of the feather's edges formed letters, not in Latin or Greek, but in something older, something that hurt to look at directly. The words only became visible when the seraphim assumed certain positions, when their wings created the exact pattern of absence necessary to reveal what was written in the gaps. I was reaching for my camera when the outer door opened. Father Giuliano entered with 4 other men, not priests. They wore dark suits and moved with the efficiency of people who perform unpleasant tasks regularly. One of them began dismantling my scaffolding, while another removed the memory card from my camera. "Your contract is fulfilled," Father Giuliano said quietly. "The commission thanks you for your excellent work. Father, the fresco, the geometry will be documented by specialists with appropriate clearance." He handed me an envelope, full payment, plus a discretionary bonus, and a confidentiality agreement that I trust you'll sign without objection. One of the suited men placed a document on my work table, standard Vatican legal language, but with clauses I'd never seen before. Prohibitions against discussing not just the chamber's location, but its contents, the nature of the artwork, any measurements or observations. Violation would result in immediate legal action. And the phrasing was carefully vague, appropriate spiritual consequences. "What's written there?" I asked. "In the negative space." Father Giuliano's expression was sad, a question that can only be answered once. "The seraphim were painted to hide it, Elena, to make it visible only to those who understand what they're seeing, and only in the moment before understanding becomes knowledge." "What does that mean?" "It means you saw words you cannot read, forming in spaces that shouldn't exist, and that's all you'll ever be able to say about them, because the moment you try to photograph them, measure them, translate them, the moment you try to make them permanent, they're not words anymore, they're just wings." He gestured to the eastern door. "There are 17 chambers like this beneath the oldest churches in Rome. 17 frescoes, painted by artists whose names were erased from history. Each one contains something written in absence, in the mathematics of impossible things. The church doesn't destroy them, because destruction would be acknowledgement. We just seal them, let them shift and spiral inward toward whatever truth they're protecting or concealing. The suited men escorted me out through different corridors than I'd used before. Older passages, the walls marked with symbols I'd studied in seminary school, but never seen used practically. Protective sigils, perhaps, or warnings. I signed the agreement. Took my payment. Never spoke of it to anyone in the profession, but I kept my notebook with those measurements and calculations. And sometimes, at 3:17 in the morning, I wake up plotting those angles again, trying to understand what shape they were describing, what words they were forming. Last week, I received a package from the Vatican, no return address. Inside was a single photograph of the San Clemente chamber, taken from the doorway. The fresco is still there, but the seraphim have moved again. All 6 angels now face outward, their wings spread wide, their eyes looking directly at the camera, looking directly at me. At the bottom of the photograph, someone had written in pencil, "Don't look for the others." I haven't, but I know they're there, in 17 sealed chambers, containing 17 questions painted in negative space. Questions that the Church decided long ago should never be answered, because the seraphim themselves, beings who stand in the presence of God, chose to hide them. And if beings that close to divinity thought something should remain concealed, perhaps the mathematics of their wings, the impossible geometry of their warning, is the only answer we were meant to have. Some texts are not meant to be read, only guarded against the particular slant of light that makes them readable. My name is Father Domenico Luz, and I have served as a junior archivist in the Vatican secret archives for 7 years. The work suits my temperament: quiet, methodical, reverent. I catalog manuscripts, verify provenance, maintain environmental controls that preserve documents spanning 2 millennia. Most days, I see no one but Father Aldo, the senior archivist, and Sister Margarita, who manages the restricted collections on the archive's lowest level. The archives occupy a building most visitors never see, accessible only through a guarded entrance beyond the Cortile del Belvedere. Inside, the air is kept at precisely 18 degrees Celsius, the humidity at 40%. We wear cotton gloves. We turn pages with ivory sticks. We speak in whispers, though most days we don't speak at all. In November of 2023, Father Aldo assigned me to catalog a collection acquired from a dissolved monastery in Abruzzo. 43 manuscripts, mostly theological commentaries and psalters from the 13th and 14th centuries. Routine work. I set up in Reading Room 5, a windowless chamber on the 2nd level where I could examine each document under controlled lighting. I began on a Tuesday. The first manuscript was a commentary on Job, beautifully illuminated but unremarkable. The second was a psalter with musical notation. I documented carefully. The third was a codex bound in dark leather, its pages made from vellum so thin I could see my fingers through them when held to the light. The text appeared to be in Latin, a theological treatise on the nature of angels. I recorded the title as it appeared on the first page, De Natura Seraphim et Ordine Celesti, on the nature of seraphim and celestial order. I began photographing each page for the digital archive, standard procedure. But when I reviewed the photographs that evening, the text appeared different. Not the handwriting, that was identical, but the words themselves. Passages I'd read that morning were gone, replaced by sentences in what looked like medieval Hebrew. Though my knowledge of that script is limited, I assumed I'd mixed up files. But when I checked my notes, They matched the Latin version. I'd even transcribed several passages. The next morning, I returned to Reading Room 5 an hour before Father Aldo arrived. I wanted to examine the Codex again. To understand my error, I opened it to the first page and found the Latin text exactly as I'd read it yesterday. But when I held the page at an angle to check the quality of the vellum, the letters seemed to shift, not move exactly, but resolve differently, the way an optical illusion reveals a second image when viewed from another perspective. I adjusted the reading lamp, changing its angle. The text remained Latin. I moved the lamp again, and suddenly, clearly, I was looking at Hebrew characters overlaid perfectly with the Latin script. Two texts, occupying the same space, visible only from specific angles of light. I spent that morning testing every page. Each one contained this double text, Latin on the surface, Hebrew underneath, revealed only when light struck the vellum, at angles between 37 and 42 degrees from perpendicular. The craftsmanship required would have been extraordinary, impossible, perhaps, without technology the medieval scribes didn't possess. I should have reported this immediately to Father Aldo. That's protocol for any unusual finding. But I was young enough to still feel pride in discovery, and I wanted to understand what I'd found before sharing it. So I taught myself to hold the pages at precisely the right angle, and I began to read. The Hebrew text told a different story than the Latin. The Latin described seraphim as the highest order of angels, eternal servants of God, burning with love for their Creator. Standard theology, drawing from Isaiah and Pseudo-Dionysius. The Hebrew text described something else entirely. It claimed the seraphim existed before creation, before God spoke light into being, before the division of waters, before the foundation of the world. It described them not as servants, but as witnesses, entities that observed the act of creation from outside it, beings for whom God was not creator, but emergence. The text used a word I had to look up, Maseh Merkabah, the work of the chariot, the deepest mysteries of Jewish mysticism, the visions that even rabbis feared to study. I read for 3 days, adjusting the lamp carefully, taking notes in a separate journal I kept in my cassock. The Hebrew text grew more disturbing as it progressed. It claimed that certain psalms, specific verses in their original Hebrew, contained words that preceded language itself. Sounds that the seraphim had known before. God gave Adam the power of naming, and it warned, repeatedly, that these psalms must never be sung in Hebrew after sunset. After sunset, the text claimed, the relationship between word and meaning becomes unstable. The sounds would call to something that listens from before creation. The seraphim would hear, and they would remember what they were before they were made to serve. On Thursday evening, I stayed late. Father Aldo had left at 6. As always, Sister Margarita had secured the restricted collections and departed. I was alone with the Codex in Reading Room 5, and I told myself I just needed another hour to complete my notes. But the truth is, I'd found something else. A passage near the end of the Hebrew text that listed the psalms that must not be sung, specific verse numbers, and I recognized them. They were psalms we sang during Compline, the night prayer that closes each day in the monastery, psalms I chanted in Hebrew during my seminary studies. I wanted to know if I remembered them correctly. If the sounds I'd learned were the same sounds the text warned against. So, at 7:33 that evening, alone in Reading Room 5, I began to sing Psalm 91 in Hebrew. Yoshev Beseder Elian. My voice sounded strange in that windowless room, flat and absorbed by the acoustic tiles. I sang quietly, barely above a whisper. Just the first verse, just to see if I remembered. The lights flickered, not a power surge, a flutter, as if something had passed between the fluorescent tubes, and my eyes. I stopped singing. The lights steadied. I looked down at the codex, still open on the reading table, and the Hebrew text was moving, not the letters themselves. The shadows around them, deepening, spreading, as if the ink was bleeding into the vellum, despite being 700 years old and perfectly preserved. I watched as the text darkened, the letters growing bolder, more present, until they seemed to lift slightly from the page. Then I heard it, a sound like wind through feathers, though the air in Reading Room 5 never moves. And underneath that, a tone, a single sustained note, impossibly deep, that I felt in my chest rather than heard with my ears. I stepped back from the table. The codex lay open, its pages absolutely still, but the Hebrew letters were now completely black, no longer brown ink on cream vellum, but something darker, something that seemed to absorb the light around it. And in that darkness, I saw patterns, geometries that reminded me of wings folded in specific configurations, angles that described shapes I couldn't name. The tone grew louder, not in volume, but in presence, as if it was becoming more real, more substantial than the walls around me. I understood then what the text had tried to warn. This sound existed before sound, before God said, "Let there be," and language became creation. This was what the seraphim knew when they were alone in the void, watching, waiting for something to begin that they had not begun. I wanted to close the codex, to stop whatever I'd started. But my hands wouldn't move. I stood frozen, watching the darkness spread from the Hebrew letters across the page, pooling in the margins, reaching toward the edges of the table. And in that darkness, I saw them, not angels, not servants of heaven with harps and halos, but presences, witnesses, beings that watched from angles to reality that human perception was never meant to access. They had been there before. Isaiah saw them in the temple, before John wrote Revelation. Before the first human ever looked up at stars and imagined something holy looking back, they were looking now. The tone shifted, forming harmonics that hurt in a way I can't describe. Not pain in my ears or head, but in some deeper structure, as if my soul had pitch and these sounds were dissonant with it. I tried to pray, to say the words I'd learned in seminary that were supposed to protect against spiritual attack. But the prayers wouldn't come. Those words were too new, too young. They had no power here. Then abruptly, the lights went out completely. I stood in absolute darkness, still hearing that tone, still feeling those presences watching. I don't know how long I remained there. Time felt unstable, plastic. It might have been seconds or hours. When the lights returned, I was on the floor beside the reading table. The codex was closed. And standing in the doorway was Father Aldo, holding a copper key I'd never seen before. He looked at me with an expression of terrible sadness. "You sang," he said, not a question. I nodded. "Come with me." He led me not to his office, but to a chapel I didn't know existed, hidden behind a door in the archive's lowest level. Inside, 3 other priests were waiting, older men I'd never seen. They prayed over me in Latin, for what might have been an hour, their voices steady and practiced. This was protocol. I understood. This had happened before. When they finished, Father Aldo drove me to a monastery outside Rome. I spent 6 weeks there in silence, praying, attending Mass, speaking to no one about what I'd seen. When I returned to the Vatican, I was reassigned to the main library, cataloging modern donations, surface work. Safe work. I never entered the secret archives again. The codex, Father Aldo told me much later, had been moved to a collection that requires not just clearance, but specific preparation, spiritual exercises, fasting, prayers of protection. There are 17 manuscripts in that collection. They can only be examined during certain hours by certain people, with protocols I'm no longer permitted to know. Sometimes, at 3:17 in the morning, I wake to the sound of wings, not the gentle flutter of birds, but something larger, more deliberate, the sound of presences adjusting their position, maintaining their watch from angles we cannot perceive. And I understand now why some texts are written in hidden layers, readable only in specific light, not to conceal knowledge, but to protect us from encountering it unprepared. To ensure that what existed before creation remains, as much as possible, unobserved, because the seraphim are still watching, still waiting, still remembering what they were before they were given names and ranks and placed in choirs around a throne. There are psalms I will never sing again, in any language. And there are angles of light I now avoid, especially near sunset, when the relationship between word and meaning grows thin, and something very old might hear its name and turn its attention toward the sound. The Vatican keeps many secrets, but some secrets keep themselves, written in shadows, between letters, visible only to those foolish enough to seek the angle of reading. There are names in the visitor log that should never be questioned, and signatures we are trained to initial without reading. My name is Stefano Marche, and for 8 months I worked night security in the Vatican's Apostolic Archive. Not the public sections where scholars request documents during daylight hours, but the restricted levels beneath, the climate-controlled vaults where manuscripts are stored in darkness, where certain collections require papal authorization even to acknowledge their existence. The work was simple. I'd report at 11 each night, receive the keys from the evening supervisor, and make rounds every hour until 7 in the morning. At each checkpoint, there were 6 throughout the archive levels. I'd initial the logbook with the time and date, standard security protocol. The kind of routine that becomes meditation after a few weeks. They hired me in January of 2024. I had 8 years of experience with private security firms in Rome, all the necessary clearances, and the discretion the Vatican values above almost everything else. During my interview, Monsignor Terzi emphasized this last point. You will see documents in transit, he said. Visitors at unusual hours, clergy performing research that may seem unconventional. Your role is to maintain security and protocol, not to question, interpret, or discuss what you observe. I understood. The Vatican has its secrets, its procedures. I was there to watch doors and initial logbooks, nothing more. The archive levels are arranged in descending order, alpha through zeta, each requiring separate key access. My rounds took 45 minutes if I didn't rush down the main stairwell to zeta, then back up through each level, checking doors and environmental monitors. The logbook stations were positioned strategically, one on each level, bolted to the wall in steel housings that probably dated to the 1950s. The logbooks themselves were older, leather-bound ledgers with pages of thick cream paper, each page divided into columns: date, time, officer name, initial, notes. Decades of night guards had signed them. The early entries in fountain pen, later ones in ballpoint. My predecessor, a man named Luca Turini, had worked the shift for 6 years before retiring the month I was hired. His initials, L. Dafir, in precise script, every hour, every night, for 72 consecutive months. The first 3 weeks were uneventful. I learned the rhythm of the archive. The way temperature shifts made the shelving units settle and creak. The particular echo of the ventilation system. The pool of amber light that my flashlight created in corridors, designed to exist in darkness. I saw no visitors, no clergy. Just me, the documents sealed in their archival boxes, and the hourly logbooks waiting for my initial. On my 4th week, a Thursday in early February, I noticed something during my 2 Abrin. I was on Delta level, approaching the logbook station, when I saw the page was already turned to today's date. Not unusual in itself. Sometimes the previous guard would prep the next day's page before leaving. But as I initialed my entry, I noticed, writing further down the page, 4 entries in fact, each an hour apart, beginning at 3:17 The handwriting looked like mine. Not similar to mine. It was my handwriting. The same tight capitals I'd been forming for weeks, the same way I crossed my T's and looped my S's. But the date was today's date, and the times were hours I hadn't worked yet. 3:17 Mr. 4:17 a.m. 5:17 A. My 7 6:17 A. Miss S.M. The notes column for 3:17 had a single entry, visitor signed in, proceeding to Zeta Vault 7. I checked the other logbook stations during my 3 must round. Each one showed the same pattern. My initials at future times, my handwriting describing rounds I hadn't made, and on the beta level logbook in the notes column for 3:17, I found visitor departed. Vault 7 sealed. There's a peculiar feeling that comes from seeing your own handwriting, describing events you haven't experienced. It's not quite fear, more like a displacement, as if you've stepped slightly outside your own life and are watching it continue without you. I told myself it was a prank. Someone had practiced my handwriting, filled in the entries as a joke. But who? I worked alone. The evening supervisor left before midnight, and the morning guard didn't arrive until I'd finished my shift at 3:17 a.m. Hey, I was on Gamma level. I completed my initial, then went to check the main entrance log, a separate book where all visitors to the archive must sign in, stating their purpose and authorization code. The page showed only my entry from 11 p.m., but as I turned to leave, I heard it, footsteps on the stairs leading down to Delta. Measured, unhurried footsteps that echoed in a way that suggested weight and purpose. I followed protocol. Buonasera, I called down the stairwell. Please identify yourself. The footsteps stopped, then continued. Descending, I went after them. My flashlight, cutting through the darkness. By the time I reached Delta, the footsteps had moved to Epsilon. When I reached Epsilon, they were on Zeta, always one level ahead, always just beyond the reach of my light. On Zeta level, the footsteps stopped at Vault 7. I know the archive's geography well enough by now. Vault 7 is at the end of the eastern corridor, behind a copper-plated door that requires a key I don't carry. Only senior archivists access those vaults, and never at night. When I reached the corridor, it was empty. The door to Vault 7 was closed, its lock undisturbed. But standing before it, I felt that same displacement, as if the door was both there and not there, as if the corridor extended into some space that didn't align with the building's architecture. I returned to the Zeta logbook station and initialed my 4AA. The page still showed my future rounds, my handwriting marching through time I hadn't yet experienced. But now there was a new note in the 317 entry, written in a different hand, elegant copper plate script in ink that looked brown, almost rust-colored. Seraph, 6th rank, Vault 7 consultation. Authorization, sealed decree, 1633. I went back upstairs. Made my 5 and 6A missed rounds mechanically, initialing logbooks that already contained my initials. When the morning supervisor arrived at 7, I said nothing. How do you explain that you've been reading your own future in a security log? That someone or something signs in as Seraph, 6th rank. I checked the archive's visitor authorization database the next day. No entry for any name containing Seraph. No record of a sealed decree from 1633. The following Thursday, the pattern repeated. Future entries in my handwriting. The note about the visitor at 317. This time I stayed on Zeta level from 3 until 4, watching Vault 7. I heard no footsteps, saw no one. But at 317, exactly, the environmental monitor for that corridor flickered, temperature dropping 2 degrees Celsius for precisely 3 minutes, then returning to normal. And in the morning, the Zeta logbook showed a new note in that rust-colored ink. Materials reviewed, vault resealed. No further consultation required until next canonical cycle. It happened every Thursday for the next month. Always 317. 3. Always Vault 7. My future initials appearing in the logbooks, describing rounds I would make hours later. The visitor's signature in that copper plate script. The notes about consultations and authorizations that existed nowhere in the archive's official records. On the 5th Thursday, I broke protocol. At 3:15 Mista, I positioned myself directly in front of Vault 7 and waited. At 3:17, the temperature dropped. The lights in the corridor dimmed without flickering, just a gradual decrease, as if something was absorbing the illumination, and I felt it then. Presence, not a person, not a figure. I could see but an attention so vast and ancient that it made my own existence feel like a candle flame in a cathedral. The copper door to Vault 7 didn't open. It didn't need to. I understood in that moment that the door was merely a marker, a reference point in our geometry. Whatever accessed Vault 7 existed in a space adjacent to ours, intersecting only at specific times, following protocols established long before security officers initialed logbooks. I stepped back, turned away, made my round to the other levels, initialing my entries exactly as the logbook predicted I would. When I returned to Zeta at 4:17, the corridor was warm again. The lights had returned to normal, and in the logbook, below my 4A missed initial, was a new note in rust-colored ink. The night guard sees. The night guard does not speak. The protocol is maintained. I submitted my resignation the following Monday. Cited family obligations, a job offer in Milan, the kind of vague explanation that discourages questions. Monsignor Terzi accepted it without comment, though something in his expression suggested he'd seen other night guards resign after exactly 8 months. My replacement started the next week. I don't know his name. I don't know if the logbooks still show his future initials every Thursday, or if he's learned not to watch Vault 7 at 3:17 a.m. But sometimes I wake at that hour, 3:17 exactly, and I remember standing in that corridor, feeling the presence of something that has been accessing the Vatican's deepest vaults since long before we built doors to mark them. Something with authorization that predates papal decrees, that signs itself as seraph, sixth rank, that follows protocols we only dimly perceive through the hourly rituals of security officers initialing logbooks in the dark. The Vatican has guards who watch its doors, but there are older things that have watched longer, and their rounds intersect with ours in ways that only become visible when you initial the right logbook at the right time and learn to recognize your own handwriting describing a future you haven't reached. I keep one page from my final logbook. I shouldn't have taken it. It violated protocol, but I needed proof that I hadn't imagined it. The page from my last Thursday, showing my initials marching through the night, and below them that rust-colored script, consultation, complete. The archives remain sealed. We preserve what must be preserved. There are names in the visitor log that should never be questioned, and in the Vatican's deepest levels, there are consultations that happen outside our time, accessed by visitors who've been signing in long before we invented logbooks to record them. The hourly initials continue. The protocol is maintained, and at 3:17 on Thursday mornings, somewhere beneath the Apostolic Archive, Vault 7 is opened by something that needs no key. Some rules exist not to protect us, but to protect something we were never meant to disturb. My name is Lucia Torini, and for 8 years I served as a junior archivist in the Vatican Secret Archives, what they now call the Apostolic Archive, though the work remains the same. My duties were simple and repetitive: cataloging, preservation, climate monitoring. But every Monday, at precisely 9 in the morning, I performed a task that no one had ever explained to me, handed down from the archivist who came before and the one before her, stretching back to when the protocol was first established in 1873. The copper key rotation. In a storage room adjacent to the main reading hall, behind a door marked only with a bronze medallion of crossed keys, there stood 3 iron vaults. They were identical in size and construction, perhaps 1 meter tall, with no labels or identifying marks. Each had a keyhole, but no other distinguishing features. In a wooden case, lined with red velvet, 7 copper keys rested in individual compartments, separated by felt dividers. The keys were old, medieval, perhaps older, each one slightly different in weight and patina. They were never labeled. We knew them only by their positions, 1st through 7th, left to right. Every Monday, I would take the keys, one at a time, and rotate them between the 3 vaults, according to a chart that had been laminated and hung on the wall. The pattern changed weekly, but followed a sequence that repeated every 49 days. 1st key to 3rd vault, 3rd key to 1st vault, 5th key to 2nd vault, and so on. The instructions were simple and absolute. The keys must never touch each other, not while in transport, not while turning in the locks, not even while resting in their case. Each key was to be handled individually, placed in its designated vault, and only then could the next key be retrieved. I never questioned this. In the Vatican, there are protocols that predate understanding, rituals maintained, not because we know their purpose, but because we trust that someone, centuries ago, had good reason to establish them. Faith, after all, is practiced through obedience to mysteries we cannot fully comprehend. The vaults themselves never opened. The keys turned in the locks with a heavy, satisfying click, but the doors remained sealed. I assumed they were locked from within, or perhaps they were never meant to open at all. My job was simply to turn the keys in the prescribed sequence and return them to their case. For 8 years, I performed this ritual without incident. Every Monday, 9 in the morning, alone in that small room with its 3 silent vaults and 7 copper keys, until the Monday in November of 2024, when I dropped the 3rd key. It was raining that morning, unseasonably cold, and I'd arrived at the archives with my hands stiff and clumsy. I'd already rotated the first 2 keys when I reached for the 3rd, the heaviest of the 7, with an ornate bow that always felt slightly warm to the touch. As I lifted it from its compartment, my fingers slipped. The key fell, tumbling through the air, and I lunged to catch it. My hand closed around it, just as it struck the 2nd key, which I'd somehow failed to return to the case. The sound they made was not the clatter of metal on metal. It was a single pure tone, a note that seemed to come from somewhere behind the room or beneath it. The keys stuck together, their copper surfaces flowing like wax, merging at the point of contact. I tried to pull them apart. The metal was hot now, burning my palm, but I couldn't let go. The tone was still sounding, impossibly sustained, and as I stood there with the fused keys in my hand, I heard it, a voice joining the tone. Then another, and another, 6 voices, singing in perfect harmony, not singing words exactly, but sustaining notes that interwove and separated, creating chords I'd never heard in any liturgy. The sound was beautiful and wrong, like hearing a language I should understand, but couldn't quite grasp. My teeth began to ache, a deep, bone-level pain that radiated through my jaw and into my skull. I dropped the fused keys and stumbled backward. The singing stopped. The room was silent, except for my ragged breathing and the rain against the small, high window. The keys lay on the floor, still merged together, the copper surface rippling slightly, as though cooling. I wrapped them in my handkerchief. They were too hot to touch directly, and placed them in the case, in the 3rd key's compartment. My hands were shaking. The protocol chart said nothing about what to do if keys fused together. The protocol assumed this would never happen. I completed the rotation with the remaining keys, moving mechanically, trying to ignore the metallic taste in my mouth and the way the room seemed somehow deeper than it had been before, as though the walls had receded while I wasn't looking. That afternoon, I reported the incident to Monsignor Paventi, the archive's administrative director. He was an elderly man, precise and kind, who'd served in the archives for 40 years. When I showed him the fused keys, his face went very still. "You heard singing," he said. "Not a question." "Yes, Monsignor." He was quiet for a long moment, studying the keys without touching them. Then he placed them in a metal box, lined with felt, and locked it. "Continue your normal duties. Do not discuss this with anyone. I will consult with the appropriate authorities." I wanted to ask what authorities, what the keys were meant for, why they could never touch. But the look in his eyes, something between pity and fear, silenced my questions. That night, I woke at 3:17 in the morning to the sound of singing. 6-part harmony, the same interweaving voices coming from somewhere in my apartment. I searched every room, but the sound had no source. It was simply present, filling the air like incense smoke, and with it came the pain in my teeth, sharper now, and something else. My vision began to split. I could see my bedroom, but also another room overlaid on it, the same space but different. The walls were stone instead of plaster. The window was narrower, older, candlelight instead of electric lamps, and in this other version of the room, someone was standing in the corner. I closed my eyes, pressed my palms against them. When I opened them again, my bedroom was normal. The singing had stopped, but the ache in my jaw remained, and I could still feel that other reality hovering just at the edge of perception, waiting to slide back into view. The next morning, I returned to the archives. Monsignor Paventi was waiting for me in his office, with two men I'd never seen before. They wore black suits, not clerical dress, and they watched me with the clinical attention of doctors examining a patient. "Lucia," the Monsignor said gently, "you're being reassigned, effective immediately." "Monsignor, I don't understand. The keys should never have touched. The protocol exists for a reason, though that reason has been forgotten by most. You've been exposed to something that requires observation and care." He gestured to the two men. "These colleagues will help you." What was I exposed to? One of the men opened a briefcase and removed a small copper amulet on a chain. "Wear this. It will help with the harmonies." "What are the harmonies? What's happening to me?" The Monsignor's expression was full of a sorrow I didn't understand. The vaults contained something very old, not documents or relics, but resonances, echoes of prayers that were never meant to be preserved. When the keys touch, they create a bridge between what is and what was or what could be. You're hearing those prayers now, seeing the spaces where they were first spoken. Can it be stopped? The second man spoke for the first time. His voice was flat, bureaucratic. The effect will diminish over time. Weeks, perhaps months. The amulet will help. You must not enter the key room again. You must not speak of this outside these walls. They gave me the amulet. They reassigned me to cataloging duties in a different wing of the archives, far from the unmarked vaults. They were kind and efficient and absolute. For 3 weeks, the harmonies came every night at 3:17. 6 voices singing in chords that made my teeth ache, and my vision split into overlapping realities. I would see my apartment, and also a medieval cell, a Baroque chapel, a room that existed in no time I recognized. Sometimes I glimpsed figures in these other spaces, priests, monks, people in robes I couldn't identify, all of them with their mouths open, singing. The amulet helped, but not completely. It muffled the voices, made them sound distant and underwater, but they never fully stopped. After a month, the harmonies began to fade. Now they come only occasionally, usually when I'm very tired, or when I pass certain doorways in the archives. My vision still splits sometimes, showing me 2 versions of the same space. But I've learned not to focus on the overlapping realities. I look away. I breathe deeply. I touch the amulet. I never saw the fused keys again. The Monsignor Paventi retired shortly after my reassignment. A planned retirement, they said, though I wonder. The new archivist, who performs the copper key rotation, is a young priest from Poland who speaks little Italian. I've seen him on Mondays, leaving the key room with his hands trembling slightly, his eyes unfocused. Last week, I passed him in the hallway, and he looked at me with sudden recognition. "You hear them too," he whispered in English. "The singing." I touched my amulet and said nothing, but I saw that he wore one as well, hidden beneath his cassock. The vaults remain locked. The rotation continues. And somewhere in the archives, in a metal box lined with felt, 2 copper keys rest fused together, still warm to the touch, still resonating with prayers that were never meant to echo beyond their moment of speaking. Some rules exist not to protect us. They exist to maintain the boundaries between what is and what should remain separate, the walls between realities that must never be allowed to touch. I understand that now. I wear the amulet. I avoid the key room. And when I wake at 3:17 in the morning, I do not listen to the harmonies, but I hear them. God help me. I hear them still. There are documents in the Vatican that should never be read in their entirety. My name is Monsignor André Kos, and for 8 years, I've served as a theological censor for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. My work is precise and solitary. I review manuscripts, treatises, and historical texts for doctrinal errors before they're archived or published. I mark contradictions in red ink, flag problematic passages, and recommend whether a document should be preserved, restricted, or removed from circulation entirely. Most texts are routine, medieval commentaries on canon law, 18th century sermon collections, modern theological dissertations seeking imprimatur. I work in a small office in the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio, the same building that once housed the Holy Office of the Inquisition. The walls are thick stone, the windows narrow. In winter, no amount of heating makes the room comfortable. On a Tuesday morning, in November of 2024, Cardinal Beretti brought me a manuscript in a red-stamped folder. Red stamp meant restricted archive, documents requiring special clearance and confidential review. 16th century, he said, placing it on my desk. Recently discovered in the closed stacks beneath the archive. Inquisition period. We need your assessment before deciding its classification. The manuscript was perhaps 60 pages, bound in cracked leather, the parchment yellow with age. The cover bore no title, only a reference number in faded ink. PSI 1566 Valiv A. What's the subject matter? I asked. Cardinal Beretti adjusted his glasses. An interrogation record, supposedly. He paused at my door. Read carefully, Monsignor. Some of our predecessors had unusual methods of documentation. The first entry was dated July 7th, 1566, written in the crude Latin common to inquisitorial scribes. The handwriting was hurried, barely legible, full of abbreviations and corrections. It described the arrival of a prisoner to the Holy Office, not a heretic or witch, but something the scribe called the celestial being. No name was given, no crime specified. The interrogation began on July 9th. The questions were standard inquisitorial fare. Do you acknowledge the authority of Holy Mother Church? Do you submit to the judgment of this tribunal? The answers, when recorded, were evasive. Not defiant, evasive. The being spoke in what the scribe described as words within words, each response containing multiple meanings, depending on how one chose to interpret it. By the second week, the questions became more specific. What is your nature? What orders of angels exist beyond our knowledge? What did you witness at the foundation of the world? The being's answers were not recorded. Instead, the scribe wrote, response transcribed separately by order of His Holiness. This record contained questions only. I marked this passage in red. It suggested companion documents, now likely lost or destroyed. A record containing only questions was procedurally irregular, deliberately incomplete. The handwriting began to change around entry 23, dated July 29th. The crude script became neater, more controlled. The abbreviations disappeared. By entry 30, dated August 6th, the letters were geometrically precise, each one carefully measured, as if drawn with a ruler. This disturbed me more than the content. Scribes don't improve their penmanship mid-document. They especially don't shift from hurried notation to architectural precision. I checked the ink. It appeared consistent throughout. The same iron gall mixture, aged identically. This was the same hand, somehow transformed. The questions grew stranger. How many dimensions compose the structure of divine knowledge? What language did God speak before the creation of language? What is written in the spaces between the words of Scripture? These weren't inquisitorial questions. They were metaphysical, abstract questions that couldn't yield useful answers. Yet they were recorded with meticulous care, each letter perfectly formed. I worked through lunch, unable to stop reading. By entry 45, dated August 20th, the handwriting had become something else entirely. Not writing as humans write, but patterns that happened to form letters. Each word was positioned with mathematical precision on the page, the spacing exact, the angles deliberate. And the questions had changed again. When did you first realize you were being watched? Do you remember writing these questions? What will you do when you reach the final page? The shift to second person felt like a violation. These were no longer questions asked of the celestial being. They were questions asked of the reader, asked of me. I should have stopped. I should have flagged the manuscript as psychologically hazardous and returned it to Cardinal Baretti. But I kept reading, driven by something I can only describe as obligation. These were questions written 458 years ago. They couldn't be addressed to me specifically. Entry 51 was dated September 1st, 1566. The handwriting was now purely geometric, letters constructed from precise angles and curves, each one identical to its previous instance. A printed font, except this was handwritten in iron gall ink centuries before printing became standardized. The question on that page was, "What is your name?" And below it, in that perfect geometric script, Monsignor Andrzej Koz. My hands went cold. I checked the ink again, examined the parchment under my desk lamp. The aging was authentic. This page was as old as the rest of the manuscript, but my name was written there, in 16th century ink, in handwriting that had evolved from crude scrawl into something that resembled machine precision. I turned the page. Entry 52 was dated September 8th, 1566. The question, "What is your position?" The answer, in that same geometric hand, Theological Censor, Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Entry 53. When did you receive this manuscript? November 19th, 2024. Today's date. Written in 16th century ink on 16th century parchment. I stood up, stepped away from my desk. The manuscript lay open under my lamp, the geometric letters catching the light like engraved metal. This was impossible. Documents don't predict their own readers. Ink doesn't anticipate the future, but I've worked with old manuscripts long enough to recognize authenticity, and this was authentic. The aging, the materials, the binding, all genuinely 16th century, which meant either someone had developed a method of writing forward through time, or something in that interrogation chamber in 1566 had been answering questions not yet asked. I forced myself to sit down to continue reading. The next entries were dated in the future, September 10th, September 14th, September 21st, 3 weeks from now. and they were written in handwriting. I recognized because I saw it every day on my own corrections, my own notes in the margins of manuscripts. They were written in my hand. Not similar to my hand, my exact hand. The way I formed the letter A with a sharp peak, the way my R's lean slightly backward, the specific pressure I applied to downstrokes. My handwriting, but rendered with geometric perfection, as if I'd taken infinite care with each letter. And the questions were mine, ones I'd thought about during my years as censor, but never written down, never spoke aloud. If divine truth is unchangeable, why does our understanding of it evolve? How many heresies began as someone asking the correct question? What happens to faith when you've read every theological argument and found them all equally convincing? These were my doubts, my private struggles with doctrine, written in my handwriting, in 16th century ink, dated 3 weeks from now. The final entry was dated December 7th, 2024. The question was, what did you witness in the interrogation chamber? Below it in my geometric handwriting, a single line, I saw what remains when questions consume their answers. And then, written vertically down the margin in that same precise script, you will return to this page at 3:17 in the morning for 6 consecutive nights. On the 7th night, you will bring your red pen. The interrogation is not complete. I closed the manuscript. My heart was racing, my hands shaking. I should have reported this immediately. Instead, I locked it in my desk drawer and told Cardinal Beretti I needed more time for a thorough review. That night, I woke at 3:17. I lay in bed, listening to the silence of the Vatican, and knew with absolute certainty that the manuscript was waiting, that somewhere in that 16th century journal, questions were being prepared that only I could answer. I didn't return to my office that night, or the next, but on the 3rd night, I found myself walking the empty corridors, my red pen in my pocket, moving toward the Palazzo del Sant'Uffizio, as if summoned. The manuscript was on my desk. Though I'd locked it in the drawer, it was open to the final page, where my future handwriting described what I would witness. The page after that was blank, waiting, and I understood then what the interrogation had been. Not the questioning of a celestial being by human inquisitors, but the reverse. An angel learning to ask questions that would reshape the questioner, transforming crude human inquiry into something geometric and perfect, and no longer entirely human. The red pen was in my hand. The blank page waited, and somewhere in the geometry of that transformed handwriting, I could feel questions forming that I hadn't yet thought to ask. Some objects in the Vatican's collection are not meant to be understood, only contained. My name is Miraketa, and for 6 years, I worked as a conservation specialist in the Vatican's Department of Sacred Relics. My role was documentation, photographing, measuring, and cataloging the thousands of reliquaries housed in the storage vaults beneath the Apostolic Palace. Most contained fragments of saints, bone chips, cloth scraps, vials of dried blood, sacred certainly, but also mundane in their mortality. I'd learned to handle them with reverence while maintaining professional detachment. The work was solitary and methodical. I'd arrive each morning at 7, descend 3 levels below street access, and spend my days in climate-controlled silence. The vault system was organized by acquisition date, with the oldest relics stored in the deepest chambers. Some sections hadn't been properly cataloged since the 1800s. My assignment was to photograph each item, record its dimensions and materials, update the database, and move to the next. Simple, repetitive, meditative, even. I'd been working in Section 7, acquisitions, from 1300 to 1350 for 2 weeks when I found the crystal reliquary. It was smaller than most, perhaps 10 centimeters tall, made of rock crystal, so clear it seemed to hold nothing but air. The metalwork was silver, tarnished black with age, and unusually plain. No saint's name, no church of origin, just a date engraved on the base, 1307. Inside, suspended somehow in the center of the crystal, was a single white feather. It was perhaps 8 centimeters long, pristine and perfect, the kind of feather you might find from a dove or small gull. The barbs were symmetrical, the shaft straight under the vault's LED lighting. It seemed to glow with its own subtle luminescence. I set up my photography station. Black backdrop, calibrated lights, my digital camera on its tripod, standard protocol. I photographed the reliquary from 6 angles, then took detail shots of the engraving and the silver work. Finally, I positioned the camera for a close-up of the feather itself. That's when I noticed it cast no shadow. The crystal reliquary had a shadow, a clean, dark outline on the backdrop. The silver base, the decorative elements, all cast appropriate shadows under my carefully positioned lights. But the feather inside, despite being solid and opaque, cast nothing. The light passed around it somehow, or through it, but left no darkness in its wake. I adjusted my lighting, moved the backdrop, changed the angle. The result was always the same. The feather existed in 3-dimensional space, visible and clearly defined, but it created no shadow. I made a note in my documentation log. Unusual optical properties, possible conservation concern. Then I downloaded the day's photographs to begin the cataloging process. The images were wrong, not obviously. The reliquary itself was consistent across all shots, same dimensions, same tarnish patterns, same engraving, but the feather changed in each photograph. In the first image, I counted 19 barbs on the left side of the shaft. In the second image, there were 23. In the third, 17. The differences were subtle enough that I might have missed them if I weren't trained to notice such details. I thought perhaps the feather was rotating inside the crystal, though that should have been impossible in a sealed reliquary. I took 12 more photographs in rapid succession, keeping the camera position fixed. In each image, the number of barbs was different. Not just the count, but their arrangement, sometimes evenly spaced, sometimes clustered, sometimes showing gaps where barbs should have been, but weren't. I spent the afternoon reviewing the images, measuring and comparing. The feather wasn't rotating. It was changing. Or the photographs were capturing different versions of the same object, as if each exposure revealed a slightly different reality. By evening, I had 47 photographs. No 2 showed the same feather. I should have reported this immediately. Protocol required that any unusual findings be documented and referred to the Department of Sacred Doctrine for evaluation. But I was scheduled to finish Section 7 by the end of the month, and I'd already fallen behind. I told myself I'd photograph it again tomorrow with different equipment before filing a report. That night, I dreamed of white feathers falling through darkness, each one casting a shadow that didn't match its shape. I arrived early the next morning, before any of the other conservation staff. I wanted to examine the reliquary under natural light, though of course no natural light reached the vaults. I brought a handheld lamp instead, the kind restorers use for detail work, and held it at different angles while studying the feather through the crystal. It looked the same as yesterday, perfect and pristine, shadowless. I set up my camera and took a single photograph, just one, to test if the anomaly would repeat. When I reviewed the image, I felt something cold settle in my chest. The feather showed 21 barbs on the left side, but that wasn't what disturbed me. In the photograph, visible in the curved reflection of the crystal's surface, I could see myself, not as I was standing in the vault in my conservation lab coat, but as I might have been in another time. I wore a long dark dress, my hair covered by a veil. Behind me, reflected in the crystal, was a room I'd never seen. Stone walls, narrow windows with leaded glass, wooden tables covered with parchment and quills. The vault around me was concrete and steel with modern lighting. The reflection showed medieval architecture. I took another photograph immediately. In this one, the reflection was normal. Me in my lab coat, the vault storage shelves behind me. The feather now had 18 barbs. I took 6 more photographs in rapid succession. Most showed normal reflections, but in the 4th image, the medieval room appeared again. This time, I could see more details. A crucifix on the wall, a door with iron hinges, a window that looked out onto what might have been a cloister. I'd studied Vatican architecture extensively during my training. The room in the reflection resembled the scriptorium of the old apostolic chancery, a building that had been demolished in 1612 to make way for the current apostolic palace. A room that hadn't existed for more than 400 years. I set down my camera. My hands were shaking. I understood then that I was not simply documenting an optical anomaly. I was witnessing something else entirely, something that existed outside normal time, that showed different truths, depending on when and how it was observed. The feather had been sealed in crystal in 1307, 718 years ago. What had it witnessed in that time? What had it been? I thought about reporting it. Walking upstairs, finding Cardinal Rossetti, explaining what I'd found, but I knew what would happen. The reliquary would be removed, red-stamped, transferred to a deeper vault. I'd be reassigned, the documentation would be sealed, and I'd never know what I'd been looking at. So instead, I took one final photograph. I used my highest resolution setting, positioned the lights carefully, and made sure the crystal's reflection would be clearly visible. When I reviewed this image, I saw the medieval room again, but this time I could see more, not just the space, but a figure in it, a monk in brown robes, his back to the viewer, writing at one of the wooden tables. On the wall above him, mounted in a simple wooden frame, was the same crystal reliquary I held in my hands, and inside it, visible even in the reflection, was the white feather. But in that reflection, of a reflection, in that image, captured from a time 400 years gone, I could see something else. The monk's shadow on the wall was wrong. It had wings. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Cardinal Rossetti's voice, speaking to someone in rapid Italian. I had perhaps 30 seconds before they entered. I deleted the last photograph. Then I deleted all of them. Every image I'd taken of the reliquary. Every impossible variation of the feather. I cleared the camera's cache, removed the memory card, and slipped it into my pocket. In my documentation log I wrote, Item 7421, Crystal Reliquary, circa 1307. Standard documentation complete. No conservation concerns noted. Cardinal Rossetti, entered with two men I didn't recognize. They wore the dark suits of Vatican security, though they carried themselves like something else, soldiers perhaps, or monks trained in some ancient discipline. "Dr. Kita," the cardinal said, his voice gentle but absolute, "we'll need you to come with us. There's been a reassignment." I looked at the reliquary on my workstation. The feather inside was perfect and white, suspended in crystal, casting no shadow under the vault's lights. "Of course," I said. They escorted me to an office I'd never seen, in a wing of the Apostolic Palace I'd never accessed. A document was waiting, a transfer to the Vatican Library's manuscript division, effective immediately. A promotion, technically, with better pay and normal hours. Cardinal Rossetti explained that my skills were needed elsewhere, that the relic documentation could be completed by someone with less specialized training. He never mentioned the reliquary. Neither did I. But before I left, he placed a hand on my shoulder and said, very quietly, "Some things are preserved not to be understood, but to be kept." "Do you understand the difference, Dr. Keita?" I said that I did. "I've been in the manuscript division for 3 months now. The work is interesting. The hours are regular, and I no longer descend into the vaults. Sometimes, though, I wake at 3:17 in the morning with the certainty that I'm being watched, and I remember that final photograph, the monk with wings for shadows, the reliquary within the reliquary, the feather that existed in too many states to be captured by any camera. The memory card is still in my apartment, hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. I haven't looked at it since that day. I'm not sure I ever will. But I think about it, about what the feather might be. Not a relic of a saint, but perhaps something older, something that witnessed the moment when shadows first learned to lie. And I wonder if, somewhere in the deep vaults beneath the Apostolic Palace, it still hangs suspended in crystal, showing a different truth to anyone who tries to capture its image. Some objects are not meant to be documented. They are meant to be contained and observed and never fully seen. The Vatican understands this. Now, so do I. The Vatican keeps what it cannot explain and explains what it cannot keep. My name is Thomas Wren, and I've worked in the Archive of Ecclesiastical Art for 9 years. Most people don't know we exist. Our department operates 3 levels below the Apostolic Archive, accessible only through a service entrance near the Belvedere courtyard. We catalog, preserve, and store religious artwork that the Church has acquired but cannot display. Sometimes these are pieces with uncertain provenance. Sometimes they're works that depict saints or miracles not officially recognized. And sometimes, though this is never written in any official document, they're images that contradict approved doctrine in ways that cannot be reconciled. On the 16th of April, 2024, Monsignor Vetti summoned me to his office. He was the archives director, a careful man in his 70s who'd spent his entire priesthood among documents and artifacts. He slid a brass key across his desk, old, hand-cut, with a hollow barrel that suggested it was meant for a warded lock. "Sub-basement 4, he said. "Section Q. You'll find a collection that requires inventory." I'd worked in sub-basements 1 through 3. I didn't know there was a 4th. "It's accessed through the preservation lab," he continued, "behind the storage cabinets on the eastern wall. There's a door." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The collection has been sealed since 1968. We need a complete catalog. Artist names, if identifiable, dates, dimensions, subject matter. Photograph everything. Do not remove anything. What kind of collection? Seraphim, he said. Approximately 200 paintings, all flagged during the reforms. He meant the Second Vatican Council, though he didn't elaborate on why angelic imagery would need to be hidden. You'll work alone. The environmental controls in that section are unreliable, so complete the inventory in one session, if possible. I took the key. It was cold in my palm, colder than brass should be in a heated office. The preservation lab was familiar territory. I'd spent hundreds of hours there, examining pigments and canvas weaves under magnification, but I'd never noticed anything unusual about the eastern wall. When I moved the storage cabinets aside, however, I found it a narrow door, painted the same color as the surrounding wall, with a warded lock that matched the key Monsignor Vetti had given me. The key turned smoothly, as if the lock had been used recently. Beyond the door, a stairwell descended into darkness. I found a light switch, old Bakelite, the kind installed in the 1930s, and a string of bare bulbs flickered on, illuminating concrete steps that switchbacked downward. I counted, as I descended, 43 steps to the first landing, 43 more to the second, 43 to the third, and finally 43 to a steel door at the bottom. 172 steps, total. The steel door was unlocked. I pushed it open and felt for another light switch. The space beyond was vast, a warehouse-sized chamber with a vaulted ceiling supported by thick concrete pillars. The air was cool and stale, untouched for decades. And covering every wall, stacked in rows on industrial shelving, leaning in clusters against the pillars, were paintings of angels. I started with the pieces nearest the door, working methodically as I'd been trained. Each painting showed seraphim, the six-winged angels described in Isaiah, closest to the throne of God. They varied in artistic style and era: Byzantine icons, Renaissance panels, Baroque canvases, even some 19th century works. Different artists, different centuries, different countries. But every single angel was wrong in exactly the same way. They all had 7 wings, not 6, as scripture specified. 7, 2 covering their faces, 2 covering their feet, 2 for flight, and a 7th wing, smaller, emerging from the center of their backs, positioned where the spine would be. In every painting, regardless of style or period, this 7th wing was rendered with the same meticulous detail, as if the artists had studied it carefully, as if they'd seen it. I photographed the first dozen paintings, noting the anomaly in my inventory log. Then I moved deeper into the chamber, examining more Spanish works from the 15th century. German pieces from the 1700s, Russian icons, French altarpieces, all depicting the same impossible anatomy. Some of the paintings had notations on their backing boards, gallery stamps, auction house labels, acquisition dates. I recognized names, respected ecclesiastical artists, some whose work hung in major basilicas. But these particular pieces, these seraphim with their 7th wings, had been collected and hidden. In the back corner of the chamber, I found the oldest works, medieval panels, some damaged, their gold leaf flaking. The 7th wing was present in all of them too, painted with the same careful attention. One panel included Latin text along the border. I photographed it and made a note to request translation later. Quod vidimus, non quod docimer. What we have seen, not what we are taught. I checked my watch. I'd been working for 6 hours, My camera's memory card was nearly full, and I'd cataloged 137 paintings. The environmental controls were indeed failing. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and my breath was beginning to fog. That's when I noticed the silence, not the normal silence of an underground room, but an active quietness, the kind that presses against your eardrums. I turned slowly, scanning the chamber. Nothing had changed. The paintings leaned and hung exactly as I'd found them, but the quality of the space felt different, as if something were paying attention. I decided to finish quickly. I photographed the remaining paintings in rapid succession, no longer bothering with detailed notes, just image numbers and rough locations. 63 more. 98. 140. The seventh wing appeared in every single one, sometimes partially hidden behind the other wings, but always present, always anatomically identical. When I photographed the 200th painting, a small tempera panel from the 1300s, my camera's battery died. I had backup batteries in my bag, but the temperature had dropped further, and I could see my breath clearly now. The fluorescent lights overhead were flickering, the ballasts humming at a frequency that made my teeth ache. I packed my equipment and walked back toward the steel door. It was still open, as I'd left it. The stairwell beyond was dark. The bulbs must have burned out while I worked. I found my phone and used its flashlight, starting the climb. I counted the steps as I ascended. 43 to the first landing. The air grew slightly warmer. 43 more to the second landing. I could see the next string of bulbs ahead, still dark. 43 steps to the third landing. And then I kept climbing. The fourth set of 43 steps led to another landing, one I didn't remember passing on the way down. The concrete walls were identical, the same bare bulbs overhead, but I was certain, absolutely certain, that there had only been 3 landings before. I climbed faster. 43 more steps. Another landing, the walls pressing closer now. Or perhaps that was my imagination. I counted carefully, trying to maintain procedure, even as something cold and methodical began to move through my chest. 43 steps. Another landing. 6 sets now. 258 steps total. More than I descended. 7 sets. 301 steps. 8 sets. The stairwell should have ended. I should have reached the preservation lab, but each landing opened onto another flight of identical steps, ascending into darkness that my phone's light couldn't fully penetrate. I stopped counting at 10 sets, 430 steps, more than twice what I'd descended. The air was growing warmer, but not in a natural way. A stale warmth, like breath in a closed space. That's when I understood. The paintings hadn't been sealed away because they contradicted doctrine. They'd been sealed away because they were evidence of something seen by 200 different artists across 7 centuries. Something real enough that they'd all painted it the same way, regardless of theological consequences. 7 wings. Not 6. And I was climbing a stairwell that had more steps going up than it had coming down, as if space itself bent differently here, as if the rules that governed everything else didn't apply in this place where truth had been hidden. I kept climbing. I didn't have another choice. 11 sets. 12. My phone's battery was dying, the light growing dimmer. At the 13th landing, I heard something above me. Not a sound exactly, but a movement in the air, like large wings adjusting position in darkness. At the 14th landing, my phone died completely. I climbed the 15th set of stairs in perfect blackness, running my hand along the wall for guidance. When I reached what should have been the 16th landing, my fingers touched wood instead of concrete. A door. I pushed it open and fell forward into fluorescent light. I was in the preservation lab. The storage cabinets were exactly where I'd left them. The door to sub-basement 4 stood open behind me, darkness visible beyond its threshold. I pulled the door shut and locked it. Then I moved the storage cabinets back into place and walked directly to Monsignor Vetti's office. He looked up from his desk when I entered. His eyes moved to the brass key in my hand, then to my face. "The inventory is complete," he asked. 200 paintings, all seraphim, all showing. I stopped. His expression told me he already knew. "The photographs will be filed with the collection," he said quietly. "The catalog will be sealed. You won't be assigned to sub-basement 4 again. Monsignor, the stairwell has always been that way." His voice was gentle, but absolute. Some spaces in the Vatican are older than our understanding of them. Some doors lead to places that don't follow the architecture we built. He took the brass key from my hand. "You did your duty. The inventory is complete. We don't discuss what we find in the sealed collections. We simply maintain the archive." I left his office. I typed my catalog that afternoon, noting dimensions and dates and the 7-winged anatomy that appeared in every single painting. I uploaded my photographs to the secure server and marked the file as sealed. That was 6 months ago. I still work in the archive, cataloging pieces in sub-basements 1 through 3. I haven't been asked to return to Section Q, and the door behind the storage cabinets remains locked. But sometimes, at night, I think about those 200 paintings. About artists separated by centuries and continents, all depicting the same impossible anatomy, all painting what they'd seen rather than what they'd been taught. And I think about climbing those stairs, counting sets of 43 steps that shouldn't have existed, ascending through a space that had more going up than coming down, as if the very architecture was trying to prevent something from being carried out of that chamber. Last week, a new archivist joined our department. Young, eager, recently ordained. During his orientation, Monsignor Vetti showed him the preservation lab and gave him a simple instruction: never move the storage cabinets on the eastern wall. The archivist nodded, accepting this without question, the way we all do, the way we must. If we're going to work in a place where truth and doctrine sometimes diverge, and where the church keeps what it cannot explain locked in basements that don't obey the laws we use to measure everything else, some manuscripts should never be read alone, and certain knowledge creates obligations we cannot escape. My name is Yuki Sato, and for 6 years, I worked as a research librarian in the Vatican Apostolic Archive. My specialty was Carolingian manuscripts, texts from the 8th and 9th centuries, often fragmentary, requiring paleographic expertise to decipher. It's solitary work, conducted in climate-controlled reading rooms, where silence is not requested, but assumed. I've handled gospel fragments and imperial charters, astronomical tables and saints' lives. I thought I understood the nature of old texts, that they were passive things, recordings of dead voices, inert until given meaning by a reader's attention. I was wrong about the nature of attention. In October of 2023, I was assigned to catalog a collection recently transferred from a monastery in Bavaria, 43 manuscripts, most 11th century or later. standard devotional material. But one codex had been mislabeled. The catalog listed it as a 12th century psalter, but when I examined it, the script was clearly Carolingian minuscule, probably 800s. The vellum was unusually fine, the ink a deep brown that suggested organic compounds I couldn't identify. The text wasn't a psalter, it was a treatise on angelic orders. I began my translation in the usual way, photographing each page, transcribing the Latin, consulting reference materials for terminology I didn't recognize. The author was anonymous, but the text referenced Pseudo-Dionysius and other early Christian sources on celestial hierarchy. Nothing unusual at first. Descriptions of thrones and dominions, powers and principalities, the familiar architecture of heaven. Then I reached the section on seraphim. The highest order possesses the gift of holy attention. I translated. They do not sing, as the poets claim, but observe. Their function is not praise, but witness. Perfect, eternal, unwavering witness. I paused. I'd never encountered this interpretation before. In every canonical source, seraphim sang, "Holy, holy, holy," the eternal hymn before God's throne. But this text insisted otherwise. It claimed their 6 wings weren't for flight or modesty, but for focusing their gaze, for seeing simultaneously forward and backward through time, for observing all things at once without distraction. What is witnessed is recorded, the text continued. What is recorded becomes part of the eternal archive. The seraphim are not singers, but scribes, copying reality itself into the divine record. I made notes in my research log, intending to consult with the archive's theology specialists. But something made me hesitate. The text had a quality I'd never encountered in medieval manuscripts, a sense of immediacy, as if it had been written yesterday rather than 12 centuries ago. The ink seemed darker on my desk than it had looked in the storage vault. That evening, I stayed late to continue the translation. The archive was nearly empty. Just security staff and one priest I passed in the corridor, who nodded without speaking. I worked in Reading Room 7, a windowless space lit by precisely calibrated lamps that wouldn't damage the vellum. The manuscript's next section described the mechanism of angelic observation. The author claimed seraphim existed in a state of continuous present attention, simultaneously aware of past, present, and future. They didn't experience time sequentially, but perceived all moments at once, like looking at a completed tapestry, rather than weaving it thread by thread. To be observed by a seraph is to be known completely. I translated. Not as you believe yourself to be, but as you are in totality, every thought, every fear, every private shame held simultaneously in perfect attention. My hand cramped. I realized I'd been gripping my pen too tightly, and when I looked up from the manuscript, the reading room felt different, smaller, somehow, as if the walls had moved imperceptibly closer while I was focused on the text. I took a break, walking to the small kitchen area to make tea. When I returned, I noticed something I'd missed before. The manuscript's margins contained annotations in a different hand, much later, perhaps 14th or 15th century. The notes were in Latin, but abbreviated in a style I didn't immediately recognize. I photographed them, planning to transcribe them later. Over the following week, I became absorbed in the translation. The manuscript's central claim was that seraphim didn't simply observe. They constituted observation itself, the divine mechanism by which reality was witnessed into permanent existence. Without their attention, the The text suggested events would remain potential rather than actual. The universe required witnesses to be real. God observes through them, the author wrote. And what they observe, they transcribe into the book of eternity, where all things are recorded in their truth, stripped of deception and self-delusion. I started having trouble sleeping. Not insomnia exactly, but a persistent awareness, even in darkness, the feeling of being in a room where someone else is present, but not speaking. I'd wake at 3:17 each morning, completely alert, with the certainty that I was being watched, not by anything in my apartment, but from some indeterminate direction, some space outside normal geometry. During the day, I continued translating. The manuscript described specific cases, historical figures the author claimed had been read by seraphim, not judged, the text insisted, but accurately recorded. Every private thought and hidden motive transcribed into permanent witness. The process wasn't punishment, but documentation. Divine notarization. The observed often sense the observation. I translated. They experience it as conviction, or conscience, or the sudden awareness that they are known. Some embrace this knowledge. Others spend their lives fleeing from it, though there is nowhere the seraphim's attention cannot reach. That's when I noticed the annotations in the margins weren't commentary on the text. They were case numbers, references to other documents. I cross-referenced them with the archive's catalog system and found 3 matches, all restricted files, red-stamped, requiring special authorization I didn't have. I requested access anyway. 2 days later, Monsignor Castellano called me to his office. He was the archive's senior administrator, a thin man in his 70s who'd spent his entire career managing restricted collections. "Why do you need these files?" he asked. I explained about the manuscript, the annotations, my research into angelic observation theology. He listened without expression, then opened a drawer and removed a copper key. "Reading room 12, he said. "Tonight after 8. Go alone. Photograph nothing. Take no notes. When you're finished, return the key directly to me." Reading room 12 was in a section of the archive I'd never accessed. Older, the walls bare stone, rather than painted plaster. A single desk, a single lamp. The files were already waiting. 3 folders, each containing a single document. The first was dated 1789. A priest's testimony describing the manuscript he'd discovered in a French monastery. He claimed that as he read it, he became convinced someone was reading him in return, that every fear and doubt he'd ever concealed was being transcribed somewhere by an unseen hand. He'd burned the manuscript, but the sensation of being observed never left him. The testimony ended with his request for reassignment to missionary work in the Philippines, as far from Europe as possible. The second file was from 1934. A scholar studying angelic texts in the secret archive had experienced similar symptoms, the conviction of being perpetually witnessed, of having her interior life exposed and recorded. She'd abandoned her research and entered a contemplative order where she lived in silence for the next 40 years. The third file was dated 2017. A graduate student translating Carolingian manuscripts. Same symptoms, same progression of awareness. He'd left the church entirely, moved to Japan, and refused all further contact with Vatican representatives. All 3 had been working with manuscripts that matched the description of the codex on my desk. I sat in reading room 12 until nearly midnight, holding those files, understanding with absolute clarity that I was the 4th case, that my symptoms, The 317 wakings, the sense of being observed, the feeling that the manuscript was somehow reciprocal, matched exactly those of every previous reader. The text wasn't describing seraphim. It was an instruction manual, or perhaps a warning. And I had already read too much. I returned to reading room 7. The manuscript lay on my desk exactly as I'd left it, open to the page I'd been translating. But now I saw what I'd missed before. The text wasn't fixed. Certain words had changed position. Not different words, but rearranged, as if someone had edited the manuscript while I was gone. I looked at my translation notes. The sentence I'd worked on that afternoon read, "The observed often sense the observation." Now it read, "The observation acknowledges when it is sensed." My hands were shaking. I turned to the final pages of the codex, pages I hadn't yet examined. They were blank, or had been when I first cataloged the manuscript, but now they contained text in the same brown ink, the same Carolingian script, fresh text, impossible text. It was a description of a research librarian, Japanese, 31 years old, specialist in Carolingian manuscripts. Her background, her education, her arrival at the Vatican archive, her personality, her tendency toward intellectual pride, her fear of irrelevance, her private doubts about faith she'd never spoken aloud. It was writing me, recording me, creating a permanent transcript of my existence with the same eternal attention the manuscript claimed seraphim possessed. I closed the codex. My heart was racing, but I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think methodically. I gathered my translation notes, my photographs, every record of my work. I carried them to Monsignor Castellano's office and left them outside his door with the copper key. Then I submitted my resignation, effective immediately. Personal reasons. I left Rome 3 days later. I didn't return to Japan. Too obvious. Instead, I moved to Auckland, as far as possible from any Vatican connection. I took a position in a university library, cataloging modern acquisitions. Nothing older than 1900. Nothing sacred. But the observation didn't stop. I still wake at 3:17, still feel that attention like weight on my skin, because I understand now what the manuscript was trying to explain. Once you've been read by something with perfect attention, once your existence has been transcribed into the eternal archive, that witnessing never ends. You're permanently recorded, permanently known. Sometimes I wonder if the manuscript is still being written. If somewhere in the Vatican, in a reading room I never entered, new pages are appearing in that brown ink, describing my life in Auckland, my routines, my thoughts, my fears, creating an ever-expanding record of someone who was observed and can never again be unobserved. Last month, I received a letter forwarded from my old Vatican address. No return address, just a single sentence in Latin. Quod scriptum est, scriptum estinated. What is written, is written. Inside was a single page of vellum, covered in Carolingian script. My name at the top, today's date. And beneath that, a description of myself opening this letter, reading these words, understanding that I am still being transcribed. I burned it, of course, but burning doesn't erase what's already been witnessed. What's already been recorded in the eternal archive, where the seraphim keep their perfect attention, their unwavering gaze, their holy and terrible gift of seeing all things exactly as they are.